330 BC, 3565 AM. On January the 31st, Alexander entered Persepolis, the religious capital of the empire and seat of the Achaemenid kings of Persia. The Macedonians sacked the city and the treasure vaults, seizing a tremendous amount of wealth. When Alexander advanced further into Media, Darius III fled again, but on the road was murdered by his own people. By the time Alexander's men caught up with him, Darius was already dying. The death of this final Persian monarch was 207 years, 2484 months, 414 times 6, from the start of the Persian Empire in 537 BC, when Cyrus took Babylon. The co-ruler with Cyrus was Darius, who became king of Babylon in 537 BC, the first and last kings of Persian Babylon named Darius. This year was 230 years, 2760 months, 552 times 5, after 560 BC, when the Persians defeated the Greek kingdom of Lydia under King Croesus. This was also 160 years, 40 times 4, after 490 BC, when Darius attacked Greece and was defeated at the Battle of Marathon. Alexander's personal historian was Callisthenes, a kinsman and student of Aristotle. Studying the records of Babylon, he found that Babylonian history spanned back 34,000 years. This is an impossible duration, but is actually a lunar code popular in antiquity. When dividing the 34,000 by 12 months, we arrive at 2833.3 years, and counting back 2833 years before 330 BC, we arrive precisely at 3163 BC, to Enoch's 70th year of ministry against the Anunnaki, the Anunnaki highly venerated at Babylon. Enoch was a prophet chronologist who designed several of the ancient world calendars, and 3163 BC was the year Stonehenge I and Newgrange were erected, Stonehenge being the ultimate three-dimensional calendar. See Anunnaki Homeworld. Studying Babylon's astronomical records, he deduced that the city's founding went back 1906 years, 2236 BC, which was only 3 years off from the date of the Great Flood, 2239 BC. Callisthenes was later executed by Alexander's order, for the Macedonian king felt he was too liberal with his opinions. In this year, Pytheas of Massilia in Gaul, France, an astronomer and mathematician and student of Hecataeus of Miletus, set sail on a secret mission around the coast of Europe to the Tin Islands, Britain and Ireland. He sailed far north and encountered the Germans and observed icebergs, also writing that the winter sun did not set. He sailed into the Arctic. He catalogued new stars and noted alterations in the tides, writing a book about his discoveries, but the learned of that time accused him of lying, of a fanciful imagination, because the scholars of the Mediterranean world believed that it was impossible for the sea to freeze, and they knew that the sun must go down, that ice mountains that floated were impossible. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 2. Ammianus Marcellinus, Book 18. 3. Alexander the Great. 327 BC, 3568 AM. Alexander crosses into Hindu Kush, beginning the Macedonian invasion of India, this being 1080 years after the Israelites invaded Canaan in 1407 BC, led by Joshua. In this year, the Joshua Comet Group, after 140 years over the ecliptic, passes through the inner solar system. The year of the conquest of Canaan in 1407 BC was 2488 Annus Mundi, and this year of the Macedonian invasion was 2488 Anno Pyramid. This was the 480th year since the founding of Macedon in 807 BC, which was 600 years after the conquest of Canaan in 1407 BC. 326 BC, 3569 AM. Alexander crossed a river guarded by the army of the Raja Porus in India during a storm, surprising them. Porus stood over 7 foot tall and employed war elephants. Porus gave the Macedonians a greater fight than did the Persians under Darius III. Alexander keeps Porus alive, then sets out defeating all of Porus's enemies, expanding Porus's kingdom, and then departs an ally. This was the 450th year, 9 jubilees of the Olympiad calendar. To the exasperation of his men, Alexander presses on and leads them deeper into India. Already the Macedonians had pretty much conquered the known world east of Greece, a feat formerly believed impossible. They were now heading into the vast unknown, and many among the Macedonian ranks were discontented with this incessant war. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 325 BC, 3570 AM. Alexander passes over the Indus River, the region of Mohenjo-Daro, and the ruins of cities under the desert of the Harappan Valley that were totally destroyed with their Elamite populations in 1849 BC. Over 15 centuries prior, at the same time Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Alexander learned that Queen Semiramis of Babylon long ago lost an entire army out there, only 20 men returning to Babylon. This is a vague reference to the Battle of Kuruksata in 1879 BC between Babylon and Elam, Proto-Persian ancestors, when the army of Babylon was totally destroyed and routed by the Elamites, who resided in the Indus Valley. That battle was 1554 years, 777 plus 777 priorly. Alexander's crossing of the Indus River was 396 years, half of 792, after the 10 tribes were carried east into Assyria in 721 BC, and 260 years, 52 times 5, after the Judahites were carried east by the Babylonians, after the fall of Judah in 585 BC. 1. Alexander the Great. 323 BC, 3572 AM. After returning to Susa in 324 BC, ending a 6-year expedition into India, Alexander finally made it back to Babylon and took up residence in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar II. He became ill, worsened, and then died, his body exposed in the hall of Nebuchadnezzar II. His own companions believed that he had been poisoned. He died at age 33. Babylon had been the head of gold in the biblical prophecy of the succession of empires, Persia being the breast and arms of silver, and Macedon was the thighs of brass. Or in another prophecy, Babylon was the lion, Medo-Persia was the bear, and Macedonia was the four-headed leopard. Alexander died exactly 60 years after his father Philip II was born in 383 BC. Alexander's death is said to have coincided with the burning of the famous Temple of Artemis of Ephesus. Alexander's 4 generals paired off, and one named Seleucus assumed the rule of the Macedonian Empire, from the Indus Valley to Ephesus in Ionia, over all of Persia, initiating the Seleucid dynasty, ruled by 2 generals. Another general seized Macedonia and Grecdom, named Antigonus, and Ptolemy secured his rule over Egypt, starting the Ptolemaic dynasty. The empire was divided into 4 regions, fulfilling the prophecy of the four-headed leopard. Ptolemy saw to Alexandria and had the world-famous city in northern Egypt built, and even founded the Alexandrian Library, which would one day house almost 1 million texts copied from stone tables, tablets, stelae, vellum, books, bones, parchment, scrolls, wooden tablets, pillar inscriptions, and papyri. In 358 AD, Hillel III, a Jewish historian, wrote that, quote, Alexander, by his personal endowments as conqueror and statesman, did more in 12 years, 144 months, to affect the future conditions of the world than any uninspired man that has ever lived, unquote. Alexander's army, train, and multitude of Greek migrants settled the area of Galilee, which until this time was virtually empty due to Arab raids. It has not escaped historians the similarity between Galilee and Gaul or Galatia. This region was a garden realm, and people from all over the Mediterranean and Greek states joined these military settlers building 10 distinct cities in the area, which was formerly allotted to the 10 tribes of Israel in western Galilee and Samaria. These 10 cities were collectively known ever afterward as the Decapolis, 10 thoroughly Greek international cities, sophisticated, wealthy, and populous. They overlooked the Sea of Galilee, and many from the Aegean, Asia Minor, and Europe settled these cities. People no doubt blood descended from the Israelites themselves, who settled the Peloponnesus, Thrace, Macedon, and Ionia between 1369 to 945 BC. It is to be remembered that the Jews' chief accusation against Jesus was that he was Galilean. 1. Alexander the Great. 2. The Poisoned King. 4. Daniel. 5. The Archco volume. 322 BC, 3573 AM. Aristotle died, his various works still seriously studied even after the passage of 23 centuries. Unlike other popular writers from antiquity whose writings were lost and then later rediscovered, Aristotle's works have always been with us. 321 BC, 3574 AM. In Italy, a people called the Samnites defeated the Romans at the Caudine Forks. The calendrics for this year identify both the Romans and the descendants of Israel. This was the 432nd year of Rome, half of 864, which was founded in 753 BC, and this was also exactly 400 years, 10 40-year generations, after the last of the 10 tribes of Israel were deported by the Assyrians in 721 BC. The description Samnites is Latin, more properly rendered the Shemites. 1. Tacitus, Annals of Imperial Rome, footnote. 319 BC, 3576 AM. The Macedonian general Ptolemy begins ruling Egypt as satrap. In 14 years he would declare himself king. This is 288 years, 144 times 2, before the final fall of Egypt to Rome in 31 BC. In this year, the 7th Baktuan of the Mayan long count calendar is complete, after 1,008,000 days, from 3113 BC. The 7th Baktuan began in 713 BC, when the dark satellite altered the Earth's solar orbit, adding 5.25 days to the length of the year. The significance here is that the prophet chronologist Enoch developed the Mayan system before the flood, and his empire was seated at antediluvian Egypt. In this year, the dark satellite returns, passing through the inner solar system, a lost moon of Nibiru. Before the flood, the Nephilim dynasty or Anunnaki dynasty that began in 2839 BC, that ruled from Egypt, started 2520 years, 360 times 7 before this date. The appearance of the dark satellite, a former rock and metal moon of enormous size, in this year, probably unseen from Earth, was 684 years after the throne of David was set up in Jerusalem in 1003 BC, which began the Davidic dynasty. And counting this same 684 years previous to 1003 BC, was the appearance of planet Phoenix in 1687 BC, that literally destroyed all the children of the sun dynasties around the world with quakes, darkening of the sun and flooding. 313 BC, 3582 AM. The Greek Seleucid calendar begins in Syria, of Macedonian origin, thus Israelite in origin. This was exactly 400 years after the solar year was altered in 713 BC by the dark satellite, the alteration of the planetary orbit affecting all calendars in the world. The calendrics for this extraordinary year reveal the importance of this new Seleucid calendar. This year was 3936 years, 666 times 6 of the Phoenix chronology, and 3726 years, 414 times 9 of the orbital chronology, that began with Earth beginning its present orbit around the Sun in 4309 BC. This was the 2800th year of the Mayan long count calendar, or 400 times 7 years. This was 1056 years, see 2839 BC for import, after the Danaan Israelite in 1369 BC began settling the Aegean and Thessaly, from which the later Macedonians emerged. This was the 690th year, 138 times 5 Phoenix orbits, since the founding of the Davidic dynasty at Jerusalem in 1003 BC. This was 408 years, 4896 months is 2448 plus 2448, after the last of the 10 tribes were deported in 721 BC by the Assyrians, and 230 years, 2760 months is 552 times 5, after the start of the Buddhist calendar in 543 BC. That this is an Israelite calendar, Syria was a people assimilated anciently with Phoenicians and Hebrews, is found in that this was 432 years, half of 864. Lastly, this was 576 years, 144 times 4, before the start of the Egyptian Christian Coptic calendar in 264 AD. Interestingly, Christianity began in Lower Syria, Galilee. 309 BC, 3586 AM. Agathocles of Greek Syracuse attacked Carthage, forcing the Carthaginians to flee and take refuge in the city. They sacrificed 500 children to Baal Hamon for their deliverance. Syracuse was founded by people descended from Israel, from those Danaan migrations 1056 years earlier in 1365 BC. This was the 4000th year of the Phoenix chronology. The Carthaginian population, too Semitic, was also an admixture of Syrians, Phoenicians and Hebrews. This was 276 years, 138 times 2, after the fall of Judah in 585 BC, many Jews being in both Carthage and in Syracuse, 1 Phoenicians. 307 BC, 3588 AM. In this year, Ashoka of India was imbued with a missionary spirit and sent out about 80,000 Buddhist missionaries throughout India, Persia, Babylonia, Palestine, Egypt, Syria, Ceylon, and as far as China and Japan. This was the 236th year of the Buddhist calendar. In this year, planet Phoenix passes through the inner solar system, completing its 138-year orbit. 1. Aryan Sun Myths. 305 BC, 3590 AM. Ptolemy declares himself king of Egypt in the 14th year of his rule as satrap, formerly a Macedonian general of Alexander the Great. 303 BC, 3592 AM. The Ptolemaic dynasty was founded in Egypt, a Macedonian dynasty. This is 1104 years, 552 plus 552, after Israel became a nation in 1407 BC. And 700 years after the Davidic dynasty was founded in 1003 BC at Jerusalem. This was 504 years, 252 plus 252, after the founding of Macedon in 807 BC. In Rome, Cnaeus Flavius published a calendar of court days, allowing the common people the ability to understand the working of civil procedure, infuriating the workers and legal men of the courts, who previously controlled and censored this information, prompting them to invent a plethora of complex legal formulas, causing the people to rely on the court officials even more. This deceptive control of public lawsuits has grown into our modern judicial system today. This was the 450th year of Rome, 5400 months, or 9 jubilees of 50 years each. 301 BC, 3596 AM. Demetrius is called Polioketes, besieger of cities of Macedonia, and besieged Rhodes with massive bronze siege towers, but failed. Demetrius had constructed a gigantic moving frame, called the City Taker, that was 130 feet high with 16 heavy catapults, all of bronze, called the Leontophorus, a massive warship that also carried 1,200 marines, and propelled by 1,600 oarsmen. His siege failed. He departed and left the gigantic siege works behind. The people of Rhodes gathered all the bronze and recast it into a gigantic statue. The statue cost him 300 talents and took 12 years to finish, called the Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. It would be felled 66 years, 792 months later, in a quake in 235 BC. This was 660 years after the Israelites finished the temple in Jerusalem in 961 BC. It was 444 years after the 10 tribes were deported by Assyria in 745 BC, and 420 years after the remaining Israelites were deported by Assyria in 721 BC. This was an approximate date for Euhemerus, who wrote Sacred History, wherein he revealed that the gods of old were really just famous people, men, and he documented the family of Zeus and the world back to Uranus. He claimed that his source material was from a golden pillar in a temple in the Indian Ocean on an island, c. 498 BC. The ancients were fond of referring to pyramids as pillars, c. 2815 BC. 1. The lost treasure of King Juba. 2. The poisoned king. Pliny, Natural History, Mining and Minerals. 298 BC, 3597 AM. Exactly 108 years after the Romans made war against the Etruscan city of Veii in 406 BC, again the Romans have a territorial dispute with the Etruscans and engage them in war. The Romans are led by Barbatus and are victorious. Until this time, the main body of Etruscan culture had remained independent of the Romans. But this date begins the total assimilation of the Semitic Etruscans into the Latin and Roman peoples. Also in this year, the Celts under their leader Cymbals invaded Macedonia but were driven back. 1. The philosopher and the Druid. 295 BC, 3600 AM. The Romans defeat the Samnites at Centium. This was 26 years after the Samnites had defeated the Romans in 321 BC. The Samnites were Shemites. This year is connected to the Israelites in a number of ways. As descendants of the pre-flood Sethites, who built the Great Pyramid in 2815 BC, 1080 AM, this year was 2520 years, 360 times 7, since the Anno Pyramid chronology began, with the completion of the Giza monument. This was 1152 years after the Exodus, 1447 BC, or 144 times 8 years, and 1260 years, half of 2520, after 1555 BC, when Italy was invaded pre-Roman war, and the Chittim pre-Romans invaded Egypt and were defeated by Israelites. This was 960 years after the Israelite Danaan dynasty was founded at Mycenae in 1255 BC, and 666 years after the temple was completed in Jerusalem in 961 BC. Lastly, this was the 450th year, 950-year jubilees, since the Israelites were deported into Assyria in 745 BC. Interestingly, this is 2400 years, 600 times 4, before the Great War of Armageddon in 2106 AD. 1. The decline of the West. 291 BC, 3604 AM. Alexandrian scholar and Egyptian priest-historian Manetho studied a particularly old book known as the Egyptian Old Chronology of Egypt that cites 113 regnal descents of kings spanning back 36,525 years. This is akin to the solar year length of 365.25 days. However, this 36,525 years is actually a lunar code designed to be divided into 13 lunar months to produce 2810 years, which started before 291 BC, singling out the year 3100 BC. This was Enoch's 108th year of rule over the Sethite dynasty. 1. Secret cities of Old South America. 281 BC, 3614 AM. Older Celts who were defeated by the Macedonians in their failed invasion in 298 BC persuaded their younger kin that the time was ripe for another attempt. So many Celts volunteered for the raids on Macedon that the leaders had to divide their army into 3 hosts. The chieftain Cerithrius led his army into the southeast, into Thrace. Brennus marched on the Paeonians to the north of Macedon, while Bolgius headed straight for the heartland of Macedon. Ptolemy, royal title for king of Macedon, set out to drive the Celts off but was killed. Having successfully subdued Macedon, The army of Bulgius, for unknown reasons, retreated north, enraging Brennus, who determined then to lead future raids by himself. This was 50 years after Alexander of Macedon conquered Persia and the East. This was also 600 years after the Israelites founded the capital of Samaria in 881 BC, and 440 years after the last of the 10 tribes were deported into Assyria in 721 BC, where they were transplanted to the northern realms where they became Celts. 280 BC, 3615 AM. A relative of Alexander the Great named Pyrrhus of the kingdom of Epirus invaded Italy and routed the Romans in 2 battles. The first battle in this year was at Heraclea, and the other would occur in 279 BC. Pyrrhus sought to take Sicily and Syracuse as well, but this angered the southern Mediterranean maritime power Carthage. Pyrrhus was exasperated at the tragic losses his forces took when they won against the Romans. This is the approximate date for when the Babylonian priest-historian Berossus composed a history of Babylon for the Greeks. His writings alleged to have derived from texts older than the flood. His books have not survived, however much has been preserved in the extensive quotations provided by several ancient authors. 279 BC, 3616 AM. Pyrrhus of Epirus defeated the Romans at Asculum, but the toll against his own army was high. Pyrrhus is recorded as saying, quote, "If we win one more battle against the Romans, we shall be completely ruined," unquote. This Roman defeat was exactly 230 years, 2760 months, 552 times 5, from the founding of the Republic of Rome in 509 BC. Privy to the intentions of Pyrrhus on Sicily and Syracuse, the Carthaginians forged an alliance with Rome and sent a fleet of warships to aid the Romans. Pyrrhus was up against too much, and with news of new Gallic invasions in northern Macedonia, Illyria, and even his kingdom of Epirus, Pyrrhus retreated after losing a battle near Naples. By this date the Romans had heavily fortified northern Italy against further Gallic invasions, and this paid off, for the Gauls, Celts of Europe, were invading all around but leaving Italy alone. Brennus led a Celtic army of over 150,000 infantry and cavalry, according to Pausanias, into the Greek world. Historians recorded that during this invasion strange thunder and earthquakes were reported. This was exactly 324 years, 108 times 3, after the Cimmerians, Israelites later known as Gauls or Celts, migrated into and settled the Balkans. The Celts enjoyed a major population explosion. At the time of these invasions of Greece, other groups of Celts migrated north and west into Asia and Europe, known as the Latinic Celts, migrating further and further down the Danube River. Brennus led an invasion of Celts toward the Greek city of Delphi, seat of the famous oracle, while 2 other Celtic leaders led armies eastward toward the Bosporus Strait between Europe and Asia. These 2 men, Leonrius and Lutorius, guided 3 tribes into Asia Minor. Lutorius settled his people toward the coast by the ruins of Troy. Leonrius, with a much larger host, went to Byzantium and entered into a treaty with King Nicomedes of Bithynia in exchange for safe passage. As part of the treaty, Celts would serve as auxiliary forces to the Bithynian army. These Celts, known as the Gauls, were free to settle in Rome, Asia Minor, but had to leave Bithynia alone. Immediately King Nicomedes began using his Celtic forces to defeat his enemies. This history is absolutely amazing. Exactly 400 years after the Danaan dynasty of Mycenae was founded in 1255 BC by the descendants of Ionian Israelites, the Assyrians drove out the dynasty of King Nicomedes, from the ancient Semitic city of Ugarit in 855 BC, these being descendants of Ionian Israelites. This exodus of the people of Nickdem was precisely 576 years, 144 times 4, before this year of 279 BC, when another wave of Israelite descendants merged with their older kin. Bithynia is a name derived from the Hebrew for house. This is the 4th and final alliance between Rome and Carthage. In this year of 279 BC, grave robbers in the Hunan province of China excavated a royal tomb and found what has come to be known as the ancient bamboo books, wherein is described a terrible earthquake and 5-planet alteration in the heavens, attended by meteoric rain and dated in Chinese seals that, according to scholars, indicate the year 1688 BC, 1 year off from actual 1687 BC Phoenix cataclysm. 1. History in quotations. 2. A short history of the world. 3. The philosopher and the Druid. 6. Phoenicians. 7. Secrets and cities of old South America. 277 BC, 3618 AM. The kingdom of Galatia is founded. The Gauls settled the coasts of Asia Minor from Pergamum to Ephesus. Archaeologists have found inscriptions of Ionian Greeks in these cities that relate that they were being overrun by Galatians. These incursions would last 7 years until put an end to by the Syrian king Antiochus I in the Battle of the Elephants. This was a reunion of two ancient branches of Israel, the early Ionic and Danaan Israelites that settled Asia Minor 1,000 years earlier, and now the post-captivity Israelites that made it to Asia Minor by way of Assyrian deportation and migration. It was here that the 7 churches of early Christianity were founded among the old Ionian cities of Asia Minor. The biblical book of Galatians sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, or lost tribes. This was 1600 years, 40 generations or 40 times 40 years, after the Abrahamic covenant was established in 1877 BC, promising that the seed of Abraham would fill the earth. This was also 444 years, golden proportion number, after 721 BC, when the last of the Israelites were taken into Assyrian captivity. 1. A short history of the world. 276 BC, 3619 AM. Ptolemy II of Egypt, son of Alexander's friend, and General Ptolemy, began using thousands of Celts as mercenary troops. The wild Celts immediately tried to take Egypt, but were quarantined on an island until they died of starvation or killed one another. This did not discourage the use of Celtic soldiers who were continually employed in service to Egypt. The Macedonian kings of Egypt used Celts to garrison their Greek holdings, and in the wars with Syria, these Macedonian regents used the Celtic soldiers. This was the 500th year of the Greek Olympiad calendar and 216 years, 108 plus 108, after 492 BC, when the Persian king Darius invaded Scythia, land of the Celts called Cimmerians, and fled away from them. 1. The philosopher and the Druid. 275 BC, 3620 AM. Emperor Asoka of India founded the 9 Unknown Men Society, an order commissioned to collect, analyse and protect the secrets of the occult. Asoka had adopted Buddhism after a war that had provoked him to become a man of peace. He built hospitals and public gardens. He believed in the education of women and dispatched missionaries to Kashmir, Persia, Egypt and abroad. In this year, Rome annexed the territories of Epirus after defeating the former forces of Pyrrhus, who had unsuccessfully invaded Italy. At this time, the Alexandrian scholar and steward of the famous library, Eratosthenes, studied among the vast archives from all over the known world. He was familiar with the Annus Mundi dating, and he believed that the early Egyptian dynasties were contorted histories as recorded in the biblical book of Genesis. According to Hecatius, Eratosthenes believed that a generation was 40 years. He estimated the circumference of the Earth and believed Earth to be spherical, dividing the planet into 60 parts, calculating its circumference to within 200 miles. He drew a map of Europe, Britain, Ireland, the Mediterranean world, Arabia, Asia and the Persian Gulf, all the way to the Horn of Africa. He theorized about unknown continents and was an expert mathematician. 1. Our haunted planet. 2. A short history of the world. 4. The origins of Greek civilization. 271 BC, 3624 AM. During the reign of Ptolemy II, the Pharos lighthouse is constructed by the architect Sostratos. The huge tower complex stood over 400 foot high, overlooking the sea with an ingenious contraption using concave metallic reflectors that was able to concentrate sunlight into beams that could burn ships miles away. The tower was accounted as one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. As this was 1628 years after Babel, which in 1899 BC earthquakes occurred in this same region of the southern Mediterranean. This is also 1628 years to the year 1356 AD, when earthquakes destroyed the final vestiges of the Pharos lighthouse. Also in this year 271 BC, planet Nibiru completes its 60 years over the ecliptic, completing its 792-year orbit as it passes back through the inner solar system. An immense strewn train breaks free of Nibiru and begins its own solar orbit as the Romanid Apocalypse comet group. 270 BC, 3625 AM. Antiochus of Syria invaded Asia Minor and defeated the Galatians in the Battle of the Elephants, ending the 7-year reign of terror of the Gauls in the Greek cities. At this time Syria was Hellenized. The Gauls had never seen elephants, and their presence brought fear to their ranks. After the battle and the settling down of the area, the Celts then began to hire themselves out as mercenaries to anyone who would pay them. The Celts were divided in Galatia so as to have 12 leaders, called the Tetrarchs. It was the Greeks who called the Celts Galatians. The Greek city of Messina in Sicily was captured by pirates. The Carthaginians quickly came to their aid and ran off the pirates, leaving a Carthaginian garrison behind. The pirates then appealed to Rome, knowing of the political hotspot Sicily was between the two Mediterranean powers. As expected, Rome favoured the side of the pirates, and again war broke out between Rome and Carthage over sea superiority. Carthage was the last purely Semitic power against the emerging might of Rome. This was 124 years, 1488 months, 744 plus 744, before 146 BC, when Rome would defeat both Carthage and the Greeks. 1. The philosopher and the Druid. 2. Post-captivity names of Israel. 267 BC, 3628 AM. The Heruli of southern Russia invade the Peloponnesus of Greece. The identity of these people is found in 476 AD, this date being the fall of Rome by the Germans, which was 744 years after this date. This was 336 years, 4032 months, after the Cimmerians, Scythians, migrated into and settled in the Balkans. The Heruli were but one tribe of this mass migration, a people descended directly from deported Israelites. This was 46 years, 552 months into the Greek Seleucid calendar of Syria. 1. The Naked Olympics. 265 BC, 3630 AM. Ptolemy Philadelphus of Egypt had 72 Hebrew Jewish priests compose 72 translations of the 5 books of Moses, Torah, completing the Greek Septuagint translation of the scriptures. The tradition holds that each priest worked alone in his own chamber, and that after 72 days the 72 translations were brought together and compared and agreed wonderfully. So popular would the Greek Septuagint text become that it would be the standard version quoted by Jesus and his apostles. This was the year 666 of the divided kingdom from 931 BC, when Israel and Judah split into the two kingdoms, and 480 years, 5760 months, 144 times 40, after the Israelites were deported into Assyria in 745 BC, 48 years of the Seleucid calendar of Syria. This year was also 990 years after the founding of the Danaan Israelite dynasty of Mycenae in 1255 BC, and 1104 years, 552 plus 552, after 1365 BC, when the Danaan settled in the Aegean and Greece. These people from Israel being the origin of the Macedonians, and Ptolemy in Egypt ruling a Macedonian dynasty. This was 320 years, 40 times 8, after the fall of Judah in 585 BC. Aristarchus of Samothrace studied at the famous Alexandrian library at this time. He believed the sun was the centre of the universe, and that the planets, including Earth, circled around it. He headed the Alexandrian library and truly developed the heliocentric system long before Galileo. A scholar and astronomer, Aristarchus wrote that the world is destroyed every 2484 years. This is by no means an arbitrary length of time, for 2484 years is exactly 18 orbits of planet Phoenix at 138 years each. or 6 cursed earth periods of 14 years each. Aristarchus was evidently in possession of information on ancient disasters, separated by the length of 2484 years. He studied the works of Homer, the Iliad and Odyssey, composing his own edition of the ancient works, providing commentaries on the texts, considered by most to be the first critical editions of Homer's works. 1. God's Laughter. 2. Cataclysm. 3. Iliad, Homer. 264 BC, 3631 AM. Rome invades Sicily, which is occupied by the Carthaginians, who garrisoned it after the attack of the pirates. This begins the Punic War. Sicily was a Greek settlement, very populous. The Carthaginians had a gigantic navy of warships. These vessels, themselves the largest in the world, called quinquiremes, ships with 5 banks of oars, which made them superior for ramming other ships, the ancient method of establishing sea superiority. But the Romans invented the prototype to the American Marines by employing a ram system with huge grappling irons and trained soldiers that would board enemy vessels, taking the naval battles to a personal level. In this year, Rome holds its first gladiatorial fights in the cattle market, where slaves were forced to fight each other for the entertainment of the public, beginning a 600-year tradition of brutality against humans and animals that would even receive corporate support as companies vied with one another as they sponsored various gladiators similar to modern-day sponsored sports. 1. A short history of the world. 259 BC, 3636 AM. The deteriorating train of the ancient Earth-killer comet group enters the inner solar system in a 19-year-long train of scattered detritus after 330 years below the ecliptic plane. This is the last time this train will enter the inner system. 251 BC, 3644 AM. At Ecnomis, the Romans defeated the Carthaginians in a naval battle. 1. A short history of the world. 247 BC, 3648 AM. In this year, the Parthians emerged dominant in Babylonia, this being exactly 476 years after the siege of Samaria in Israel began in 723 BC by the Assyrians. The Parthians will reign over the Near East for 476 years until 230 AD. As will be shown later, the Parthians were those Israelites who were deported into Persia. They remained entirely independent from the Jews that occupied Persia and were settled much later. This Parthian dynasty began 2592 years, 864 times 3, after the Anunnaki Nephilim dynasty before the flood in 2839 BC, when Noah was born. This was 504 years, 252 plus 252, of the Babylonian Nabonassar calendar that began in 751 BC and was 360 years after 607 BC, when the Babylonians defeated the Egyptians and the Second Babylonian Empire began, when Israelites fought in the ranks of the Near Eastern armies. This was 290 years after the fall of Babylon to Persia, plenty of time for the population growth and emergence of the Parthians. This was the 1200th year from the Exodus in 1447 BC. Also in this year, the son of Demetrius of Macedon, named Gonatas, attacked Egypt with his own gigantic siegecraft. His father's was called Leontophorus and was left at Rhodes, where the people made the Colossus of Rhodes with all the scrap bronze. Gonatas made a larger mobile fortress on a ship, 3-masted, called Triarmenos, a floating castle. His fleet attacked Egypt and defeated Ptolemy II. This was 560 years, 70 times 8, after Macedon was founded in 807 BC, this being a war between 2 Macedonian dynasties, one in the motherland and the other in Egypt. This was also 84 years, 1008 months after Alexander became king of Egypt, won the lost treasure of King Juba. 241 BC, 3654 AM. The Romans were exhausted in resources and made a last effort against the Carthaginians, defeating their navy at the Battle of the Augustan Isles, prompting Carthage to sue for peace, ending the Punic War. All of Sicily, except for the Greek kingdom of Syracuse, was ceded over to Rome, as well as Sardinia and Corsica. This was 690 years, 138 times 5, after Israel and Judah split in 931 BC, and 504 years, 252 plus 252, after the Israelites were deported by Assyria in 745 BC. This was 720 years after the temple was finished in Jerusalem in 961 BC, and the 72nd year of the Greek Seleucid calendar of Syria. This was 480 years after the last of the 10 tribes were deported to Assyria in 721 BC. With the descendants of Israel filling the earth, including Sicily, Sardinia, Carthage, Syracuse, and even in Rome, we find none of these timelines unusual. Finally, this battle was 1998 years, 666 times 3, after the Great Flood in 2239 BC. At the conclusion of the Punic War, the Carthaginian troops stationed in Sardinia and Sicily, angered over not receiving adequate pay, raided a considerable amount of Carthaginian towns. Carthage sent an ambassador named Hasdrubal, thinking he would be respected by those offended, but they tortured him and then killed him together with all the Carthaginian prisoners they had taken. This parallels the history of Zepho, the grandson of Esau, who ruled over the Chittim of Italia along the Tiber River and made war with northern Africa. In this war, the African named Asdrubal was killed. 1. March of the Titans, A Short History of the World. 2. Machiavelli, Discourses, Book 3. 240 BC, 3655 AM. This is the final year of the train from the deteriorating ancient Earth-killer comet group as it passes through the inner system for the final time. This comet was seen and recorded by the Chinese and other ancient star watchers. This same comet will burn out in 174 BC and be clearly seen, this being 66 years, 792 months. In this year, Archimedes, the astronomer and philosopher, is 47 years old. He dies in 212 BC. He experimented with optical instruments made of glass and crystal, or gems for various lenses. 1. The first Genesis. 2. Introduction to comets. 237 BC, 3658 AM. Carthage sent an army to occupy Spain that remained there for 18 years to 219 BC. Spain was a territory highly contended over between Rome and Carthage. This was just 72 years after the Carthaginians fought for their lives when Syracuse was invaded in 309 BC. 1. March of the Titans. 235 BC, 3660 AM. The Colossus of Rhodes, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, made from the scrap bronze left behind by a massive siege construction of bronze of Demetrius, was felled in an earthquake in this year, 66 years after it was erected. It had stood 108 feet tall. 66 years is 792 months. 1. Secret Teachings of All Ages. Note, there is a chance that this has been dated incorrectly. The statue required 12 years to erect. The true date of the quake that destroyed it may have been the year 224 BC. 232 BC, 3663 AM. Flaminius pressed the other Roman leaders to undertake the subjugation of Cisalpine Gaul. This was 66 years after the Romans defeated the Etruscans in 298 BC, or 792 months. 1. The decline of the West. 226 BC, 3669 AM. Artaxerxes, now a royal title in Persia, issued a decree making Zoroastrianism the official Persian religion, prohibiting all religions other than the religion of the Magi. Throughout Media and Persia, the Magi grew in prestige in tandem with the rise of the Parthians. 1. Zoroastrianism. 225 BC, 3670 AM. The Celtic tribes of Cisalpine Gaul, namely the Boii, Innsbres and Turisci, along with other Celtic mercenaries from the tribe of the Gesetae, spearmen, assembled after being agitated by the Romans and decided to put an end to Rome. They marched down the Po River, but the Romans learned of their approach and went out to meet them in Etruria, defeating the Celts in the Battle of Telamon. Polybius recorded the battle. 40,000 Celts are said to have died. This year was 520 years, 52 times 10, after the Israelite ancestors of the Celts were carried into Assyrian captivity in 745 BC, and 54 years, half of 108, after the Celts invaded northern Italy in 279 BC. An incredible pattern is unveiled in this history. In 945 BC, King Solomon, Jedediah, sold 20 Israelite cities to Phoenicia, and many migrations of Israelites departed by way of Phoenicia since. That was 360 years before 585 BC, when the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem and deported the Judahites into the east. The fall of Judah in 585 BC was itself 360 years to 255 BC, when the Celts were slaughtered in the Battle of Telamon, the Roman-Celtic controversy and extension of the more ancient conflict between Jacob, Israel, and Esau, the line of Esau early on taking root in ancient Italia through his grandson Zepho. Counting another 360 years into the future lands us at 135 AD, when the Romans totally destroyed Jerusalem and killed or sold into slavery the entire nation of the Jews, ending the Bar Kokhba rebellion. This entire span of time covers 1080 years, 945 BC to 135 AD. 222 BC, 3673 AM. As the Romanid Apocalypse comet group passed through the inner solar system, two gigantic celestial objects appeared in the sky with our own moon, described as two moons. This occurred in the consulship of Gnaeus Domitius and Gaius Fannius, according to Pliny in Natural History. Massive earthquakes were felt in the Mediterranean. 1. Natural History Pliny, Universe and the World. 2. The Poison King. 221 BC, 3674 AM. The Qin dynasty begins in China after all the warring provinces are unified under Emperor Qi Huangdi, known as China's first or universal emperor, a ruler having been king since 246 BC. Interestingly, this year was 1656 years after 1877 BC, when the Abrahamic Covenant was instituted. 219 BC, 3676 AM. A major Chinese naval expedition set out into the Pacific Ocean and never returned. The last time this occurred from China was in 1123 BC, when 250,000 Chinese sailed to ancient America 904 years earlier. The exact dates of the 1123 BC departure is unknown, only that they left in haste because of a war and change of dynasty. 900 years is 10,800 months. This was 1680 years after the Babel dispersion in 1899 BC, when people first arrived in the Far East, and this is also the 324th year of the Buddhist calendar that began in 543 BC. 1. Hitchhiker's Guide to Armageddon. 218 BC, 3677 AM. The Second Punic War was initiated by Carthage, when Hannibal of Carthage with 50,000 troops and 37 war elephants sailed to Spain, passing his army over the Ebro River, Hebrew River, which was considered an act of war by Rome, who controlled the territory. After attacking the Roman holdings, Hannibal marched his army over the Alps, losing many men, and 36 of the 37 elephants due to the severe cold weather. In northern Italy, Hannibal allied himself to the Cisalpine Gauls, or Celts, and many joined his ranks against their Roman enemies. He carried on the Second Punic War for 15 years on Roman soil, the war itself being 18 years long. Every Roman army that opposed him was defeated, but without siege equipment he could not take Rome. The conflict was called Punic Wars because this was the Latin rendering for Phoenician, a people who founded Carthage. This history of the North African Roman War had already occurred 1260 years before, in 1478 BC, when Annibal, origin of Hannibal, of northern Africa, invaded Italia of the Chittim, pre-Roman Italy, and remained for 18 years fighting the local Chittim. The entire episode a repeat of this historic invasion, as recorded in the Book of Jasher. This year of the Punic invasion was 72 years before the Romans in 146 BC would completely defeat and destroy Carthage. Of interest is the calendrical fact that this invasion against Rome was 1229 years after the Israelites escaped Africa in 1447 BC in the Exodus, and in 1229 BC the Roman ancestors, the Trojans, were invaded by the Danaan and Proto-Greek peoples in the Trojan War, the Danaan being early Danites or Israelites, many whom settled among the Phoenicians and Carthaginians. 217 BC, 3678 AM. During the Second Punic War, there were 57 earthquake tremors felt at Rome in this year alone. This occurred in the 5th year of the passing of the Romanid Apocalypse Comet Group. Because of growing fears of Hannibal as he terrorized the Roman countryside, the Roman Senate officially consulted the books of the Sibyl, the ancient Hebrew prophetess college. This was the last official Roman consultation of the books. 1. Pliny Natural History, Universe and the World. 2. The Oxford Illustrated Companion to. 216 BC, 3679 AM. Hannibal led his army with an army of Gauls against a Roman army and defeated them in the Battle of Cannae. Also in this year, an army of Gauls, the Boii, trapped a Roman army and slaughtered them. Their Roman leader Lucius Postumius was decapitated, and the Gauls turned his skull into a gold-gilt drinking cup. Julius Obsequens wrote that in this year, objects like ships were seen passing through the skies over Italy, and a round shield, comet or platoid, was seen, the sky on fire. The Punic War is interesting because here we have the contact of allies involving two distinct branches of Israelites. The Phoenicians absorbed into their population those Israelites that migrated in antiquity in the 13th to 9th centuries BC, and the Gauls were descended from Cimmerians, Scythians, that were in turn Israelites deported into northern Assyria in 745 and 721 BC. In the year 1584 BC, North African armies attacked Italia, this being 1368 years earlier, or 684 plus 684 years. This same number in months is 132 years, and 132 years before this date was 348 BC, when Roman Carthage entered a trade alliance with Carthage, gaining the advantage. This year was 180 years after the Etruscan city of Veii fell to the Romans, after 10 years of war in 396 BC. Lastly, this was 70 years before the Romans would totally defeat and destroy Carthage in 146 BC. 1. The Philosopher and the Druid. 2. Gods of Eden. Brambly. 215 BC, 3680 AM. During the Second Punic War, historians attest at that time it rained blood. The Romanid Apocalypse Comet Group was still passing through the inner solar system. The rain of blood was something widely recorded around the world in ancient times, with incidents that will be revealed all the way up to the 19th century AD. There is a vast amount of reddish frozen mud orbiting the Sun in strewn fields that Earth occasionally passes through, causing the blood rain events. Hannibal and the Gauls pushed back the Romans and laid waste to the entire country, excepting Rome. This was 666 years after the founding of the Israelite capital city of Samaria, origin for Cimmerian, and exactly 690 years before 476 AD, when the Germans finally defeated and took Rome, the sum of 690 being 138 times 5, 138 being the orbital length of Phoenix. This was 2898 years of the Mayan calendar and 2600 Anno Pyramid, or exactly 52 times 50 Jubilees. This is also the approximate date for when the Macedonian king of Egypt, Ptolemy IV, commissioned the Alexandris, the largest ship in the world at 450 feet long. She had a 57-foot beam and 57-foot long oars, carrying 400 officers and 2850 marines, requiring 4,000 rowers. Aboard, some quarters were luxurious, with hot baths, a full-sized kitchen galley, and a shrine to Poseidon, Greek god of the sea. The huge battleship was outfitted with catapults that could hurl 50-pound boulders. No doubt Ptolemy was inspired by the engineering genius of those who built the gigantic floating siege constructions for Demetrius and his son Gonatas earlier. The immense ship was a symbol of Egypt's wealth and power under the Macedonian rule, though it never had a chance to be used in any military campaigns. 200 years later its hull was still afloat, docked in a Greek harbour. 1. Commentaries on the occult philosophy of Agrippa. 2. The lost treasure of King Juba. 213 BC, 3682 AM. Universal Emperor of China, Qi Huangti, in this year, began the monumental Great Wall of China, the walled frontier and border fortresses erected to keep out the northern barbarians, the ancient Mongol enemies. Also in this year, Huang Ti had all the known books his agents could gather throughout China burned in a campaign to erase the past. This was the 330th year of the Buddhist calendar that began in 543 BC. This was also the 500th year since Earth's orbit was altered and the solar year changed from 360 days to 365.25 days. 1. Mysteries and Magic. 211 BC, 3684 AM. The Roman navies besieged the Greek settlement of Syracuse, but were driven off by a device designed by Archimedes that reflected and concentrated sunlight, burning the Roman ships from a distance. Syracuse was founded anciently by descendants of Israel. Also in this year, other descendants of Israel through the Phoenician lines attacked Italy in the Carthaginian army, which marched all the way to the Anio River, 3 miles from Rome, in the Second Punic War. This year was precisely 1200 years, 14,400 months, after 1411 BC, when the Israelites invaded Argob and Bashan, defeating the giants under Sihon and Og. It was 792 years after the founding of the Davidic dynasty of Jerusalem in 1003 BC, and 720 years of the divided kingdom since 931 BC, when Israel and Judah separated. 1. Atlantis and the kingdom of the Neanderthals. 207 BC, 3688 AM. Hannibal's brother named Hasdrubal was defeated in the Battle of Metaurus by the Romans in the Second Punic War. The names Hannibal and Hasdrubal were ancient ones that first appeared in the historical record as brothers during a series of wars between northern Africa and Italia from 1565 to 1478 BC, then being Annibal and Asdrubal. This was 720 years after many Israelites fled through Phoenician ports in 927 BC from the invasion by Egypt when the temple in Jerusalem was first sacked. This was the 1200th year since Israel had become a nation in 1407 BC by conquest. This was 138 years, 1656 months, after another disaster for the Phoenicians. In 345 BC, when the Persians attacked Sidon and deported the people back to Babylon. This year was 72 years after Carthage and Rome forged an alliance against Pyrrhus of Epirus, who had defeated the Romans in Italy. This year is 684 years before the fall of Rome in 476 AD by the Germans, descendants of the Cimmerians. In this year, universal emperor Qi Huangti died, ending his dynastic line, and the entire empire broke apart into warring states. A famine begins killing myriads in China, lasting until 204 BC. The Irish annals reveal that a disease killed off a lot of livestock in this year. This was the 15th year of the Romanid apocalypse comet group passing through the inner system. 206 BC, 3689 AM. The Romans were startled to see 2 suns in the sky over Rome, according to Livy. This was the 16th year of the Romanid apocalypse comet group, and this second sun, no doubt being a locally passing object, brilliantly reflecting the sun's light. 1. Voyages of the Pyramid Builders. 205 BC, 3690 AM. The Black Stone of Pergamum, Asia Minor, was brought ceremoniously to Rome For the books of the Sibyl had foretold that the victor of the war would be to the people who possessed some sacred stone. This rock from Pergamum was believed to be a meteorite. Quite coincidentally, in this year over Italy and the Mediterranean, historians say that stones rained from the sky. This was the 17th year of the passing of the Roman apocalypse comet group train. This was the 4104th year of the Phoenix chronology, and 3168 of the Olmec calendar, and 2898 of the Vedic calendar. Interestingly, this was the 540th year of the deportation of the Israelites by Assyria in 745 BC, many of those returning to Asia Minor and settling in Pergamon. 1. Celtic myths and legends. 2. Voyages of the pyramid builders. 204 BC, 3691 AM. The famine in China is devastating. Odd lights and things are seen in the skies over Italy and the Mediterranean. This is the 18th year of the passing of the Roman apocalypse comet group. 202 BC, 3693 AM. The Romans changed their war strategy, knowing that Hannibal was undefeatable on their own soil. During the Second Punic War, they had tried over and over again, and every army that opposed Hannibal was defeated. A Roman army passed over the Mediterranean and landed in northern Africa and took the war to Carthage. Hannibal returned to Africa and was defeated by the Romans under the very walls of Carthage in the Battle of Zama by the Roman general Scipio Africanus the Elder. Carthage fell to Rome. This was exactly 204 years after the Romans attacked the Etruscan city of Veii in 406 BC, and this victory over Carthage was 56 years to the final fall and destruction of Carthage by Rome in 146 BC. 1. A short history of the world. 201 BC, 3694 AM. The Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage ends with Rome victorious, Carthage surrendering Spain, largely Semitic, and paying Rome an enormous sum in war reparations. The people of Carthage agree to hand over Hannibal, the greatest enemy Rome had ever had, but the wily general escaped. This was the 552nd year of Rome, and 476 years after the Assyrians destroyed the Phoenician city of Sidon, Carthage filled with descendants of the Sidonians. This was also 520 years after the Assyrians deported the last of the Israelites in 721 BC. This was 144 years after 345 BC, when the Persians captured Sidon and deported its people east to Babylon, and 108 years after 309 BC, when Greek Syracuse attacked Carthage and almost defeated the Carthaginians. 1. A short history of the world. 200 BC, 3695 AM. Rome makes war against Philip V of Macedon, lasting until 197 BC. This is 576 of the Greek Olympiad calendar, and 138 years after Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander, becomes supreme over Athens and Thebes and the other Greek states in 338 BC. 197 BC, 3698 AM. This year ends the Macedonian War between Rome and Philip V. Also, Rome annexed the eastern and southern coastal regions of Spain, sending only a small force to occupy what they believed was going to be a peaceful takeover. Initially, the Romans were well received because they were seen as liberators, freeing the populace from Carthaginian influence. But Roman oppression followed and soon had Iberia, Spain, in revolt. The nearby Celtiberians of the unoccupied territories outside Roman jurisdiction, aiding as hordes of Celts offered their arms against Rome. Strabo recorded that in this year the volcano on Thera erupted, this same volcano being the one that blew apart the island in 1447 BC, covering Egypt in volcanic ash. This was 552 years after 749 BC, when the Romans kidnapped many Sabine women, the Sabines being Gauls, Celts, akin to those of Iberia that the Romans were now at war with. This was 460 years after the ruling families of Corinth migrated in exile to Macedon in 657 BC, this being the end of the Roman war against Macedon and Philip V. Interestingly, in 1565 BC, the people of northern Africa attacked Italia. this being 684 years before 881 BC, when the Israelites built their capital city Samaria, origin of Cimmerians. Counting another 684 years after this was the year 197 BC, when Rome made war against the descendants of the Cimmerians called the Celts. 195 BC, 3700 AM. The Romans continually searched for Hannibal, their most wanted enemy. Hannibal flees North Africa for Asia. The famous Rosetta Stone is sculpted in the reign of Ptolemy V of Egypt, a trilingual inscription discovered in 1799 AD by Napoleon Bonaparte's men. It was because of this trilingual inscription that scholars were able to translate the difficult Egyptian hieroglyphics. 1. The Poison King. 2. Historical deception. 191 BC, 3704 AM. Hannibal was given asylum in the court of Antiochus III of Syria, a Seleucid dynasty king founded by Macedonia. At the advisement of Hannibal, Antiochus invades Greece, knowing this to be an act of war against Rome, but the Syrian armies met with a disastrous defeat at Thermopylae. This was 144 years after 335 BC, when the Macedonian army razed the Greek city of Thebes to the ground and sold off the citizens as slaves, and 288 years after 479 BC, when the Greeks slaughtered the invading Persian army at Plataea. As the Romans are victorious over the Assyrians, a people thoroughly mixed with Israelite blood, this was 666 years before the fall of Rome in 476 AD. 1. The Poison King. 189 BC, 3706 AM. Antiochus III of Syria and his military advisor Hannibal of Carthage are defeated by the Romans at Magnesia, south of Pergamon. Hannibal is invited to Bithynia. Many of those fighting on the side of Syria and Asia Minor were Celts, Gauls, and the original settlers of Asia Minor were descended from Israelites. This was 414 years after the Cimmerians settled in the Balkans in 603 BC, the year Babylon captured Jerusalem. This was 396 years after the Babylonians totally destroyed Jerusalem and the Temple. This was also 124 of the Seleucid calendar of Syria, or 1488 months. This was 90 years after the Celts allied themselves to Bithynia and the Romans were defeated at Osculum by Pyrrhus of Epirus in Italy in 279 BC. 179 BC, 3716 AM. Rome subdues the Celtiberians and ends their aid to the Iberian resistance, though Celtiberia itself remains free of Roman occupation. This was 1460 years after Manasseh and Ephraim were adopted into the family of Israel, Ephraim being those Israelites that migrated further west, and Iberia was the further west anyone at this time could go in Europe. This was the 330th year of Rome, 3960 months being 792 times 5. 175 BC, 3720 AM. Antiochus Epiphanes IV becomes king of Syria, a tyrant diabolically opposed to Judaism. As a regent of the Macedonian Seleucid dynasty, Antiochus IV sought to Hellenize the entire domain under his rule, including Judea. His dynastic dream was to subdue his Egyptian rivals, the Macedonian Ptolemaic dynasty. In the prophetic book of Daniel, Antiochus IV is the king of the north, who wages war against the king of the south, Egypt. The first year of this rule was the 138th year of the Greek-Syrian Seleucid calendar that began in 313 BC. 174 BC, 3721 AM. After 66 years orbiting the Sun, the remnants of the ancient Earth-killer comet group passed back over the ecliptic, beginning in 193 BC, the train scattering and the group never being seen again as a strewn field. In this, the 19th and final year of the passing of the train of debris, during the Roman consulship of Spurius Postumius and Quintus Mucius, two suns appeared in midday. This would have been a locally passing object reflecting the sun's brilliant light. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 171 BC, 3724 AM. In this year the Romans invade Greece, initiating the Third Macedonian War. This is 1080 years after the founding of the Danaan dynasty of Mycenae in the Peloponnesus, an Israelite people that brought about the culture we call Greek. This was 108 times 10, but counting just 108 years before 171 BC was 279 BC, when the Romans were defeated by Pyrrhus of Epirus near Osculum. Epirus founded by descendants of Israel, a sister kingdom to Macedon. Also in this year Antiochus IV of Syria invades Egypt, king of the north against the king of the south in prophetic literature, defeating a large Egyptian army at Pelusium. He returned to Syria with much spoil. This was 756 years after the Egyptians in 927 BC sacked Jerusalem and the Temple. This was also the 3500th year, 70 Jubilees, of the Jewish calendar that began in 3671 BC. This was 432 years after 603 BC, when Egypt tried to oppose Babylon over Jerusalem and lost. The high priest Jason at Jerusalem introduced Grecian customs, games, a gymnasium and styles. He enticed the youth of Judea to enjoy Greek lifestyle and fashion, built a tower for these activities, and he neglected the sacrifice in the temple. This enraged the older population, the traditionalists. This occurred 414 years after the fall of Judah, a cursed earth period, and destruction of the Jerusalem and the temple in 585 BC. This occurred 414 years, the cursed earth period, after the fall of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 585 BC. William Dankenbring observes astutely that the people were outraged because the games were performed in the nude, and right at the temple precinct. This began the 2300 days until the cleansing of the temple in 165 BC, prophesied by Daniel. 169 BC, 37:26 AM. Antiochus IV invades Judea and then Egypt a second time. The Seleucid king sacks the temple in Jerusalem. This was 1242 years after 1411 BC, when the Israelites took by force the regions of Argob and Bashan in Syria and northern Israel. This was 792 years after the temple was completed in 961 BC, and 576 years after the Assyrians took the 10 tribes of Israel in 745 BC, and 552 years after the Assyrians returned and took the remaining Israelites in 721 BC, after the siege and fall of Samaria. This was the 144th year of the Seleucid calendar of Syria. Planet Phoenix passed through the inner solar system, completing its 138-year orbit. No records indicating that it was seen. This was 4140 years of the Phoenix chronology, and 2070 after the Great Deluge in 2239 BC. 168 BC, 37:27 AM. Rome conquers and dismantles the Macedonian kingdom. This is exactly 168 years after 336 BC, when Philip II was assassinated and Alexander emerged as king of Macedon. Philip had in this year been placed in charge of a pan-Hellenic federation of troops of the Greek states. This 168 years ended in 168 BC, counting 168 years to 1 AD, when the Romans destroyed thousands of Greek prophetic texts. Antiochus IV of Syria invades Egypt again, but this time he is opposed by a Roman general. The Roman draws a circle in the sand around Antiochus, and then dares him to step out of it before declaring peace. Enraged and humiliated, Antiochus returns to Syria by way of Judea. The Roman intervention against Syria rescuing Egypt was foretold in the prophetic text of Daniel, c. 534 BC, concerning the ships of Chittim, Romans, that would deter Syria's attack on Egypt. The book of Jasher specifically refers to the land of the Chittim as Italia. Carthaginian general Hannibal advised Antiochus not to make war against the Romans, unless it was on their own soil in Italy, for it was only in Italy that a Roman army could be defeated, not in the field. Humiliated, Antiochus IV invades Judea and sacks the temple, embarking on a campaign to eradicate the Judaic religion. He profanes the temple with pig's blood, an unclean animal that he knows the Jews abhor. All discovered copies of the law and Torah and any writings of the prophets are burned, and begins a whole series of public executions. This occurs exactly 408 years from the year when Daniel made this prophecy in 576 BC. It was in 2448 AM that the ancient Israelites received the law from God given through Moses at Mount Sinai. The high priest Onias III fled Jerusalem and took up in Egypt at the island of Elephantine at the temple of Bubastis, a rebuilt Jewish temple. 1 Jasher, 2 Machiavellic Discourses, Book 2, 3 The God Kings of Outremer. 167 BC, 3728 AM. With the Romans gone from Egypt, Antiochus IV invades Egypt for the third time, returning to massacre much of the population of Jerusalem, the temple being rededicated to Zeus. Mattathias the Hasmonean and his sons lead a revolt against Syria. The Romans invade Epirus, the kingdom of Pyrrhus, who had defeated the Romans in a series of battles in Italy over a century earlier, and enslaved the entire population. The cities and countryside were emptied and the people sold on the Mediterranean slave markets. This was 1244 years after the Israelites invaded Argob and Bashan, Syria and northern Israel, in 1411 BC. The relevance is because Epirus was descended from Israelites in migration directly kin to the Macedonians. Alexander the Great's mother was a princess of Epirus. The Epirus-Israelite connection is supported further in Calendrix. In 1447 BC, the Israelites migrated out of Egypt and into the wilderness. 640 years later, 16 generations of 40 years, the kingdom of Macedon was founded in 807 BC, the kingdom of Epirus splintering away from Macedon some time after. Counting another 640 years after Macedon's beginning brings us to this year, when Rome enslaved and totally ended forever the kingdom of Epirus. Note that this was 490 years after the royal families of Corinth migrate to Macedon in 657 BC. 1. The Jesus Papers, 2. The Poison King. 165 BC, 3730 AM. The Jewish Macabean revolt is overthrown by Antiochus IV, called Epiphanes, like God. The king of Syria is killed and the Jews begin to cleanse the temple. This is 1242 years after Israel became a nation in 1407 BC, occupying then what would later become southern Syria. This was the 148th year into the Seleucid calendar of Syria. Also, this was 432 years after the temple was sacked by Babylon in 597 BC. This begins a 102-year countdown to the fall of Judea to Rome in 63 BC, 102 years after being 1224 months, half of 2448. 162 BC, 3733 AM. Rome sacked Carthage in the Second Punic War. This was an unprovoked attack exactly 480 years after another unprovoked attack against Israelite-descended peoples living along the Sabine, the Battle of Mantrap Wood in 642 BC. 161 BC, 3734 AM. The Jews cleansed the temple in Jerusalem exactly 2300 evenings and mornings after it was desecrated by Antiochus IV with pig's blood. This reconsecration of the temple begins a 144-year countdown to 17 BC and the construction of the Herodian temple in Jerusalem. There are historical reports of a putrid rain from the sky and reddish contamination in ponds and lakes. A plague originated in the East, the Middle East, Persia, killing tens of thousands before reaching the provincial territories and states of Rome. This was the 800th year since the completion of the temple in Jerusalem in 961 BC. This is the 720th year since the Israelites built their capital city Samaria in 881 BC. This was 552 years after God delivered Judah from the Assyrian army of Sennacherib in 713 BC. 1 Daniel, 2 Egypt, Greece and Rome. 160 BC, 3735 AM. Judas Maccabees begins his reign over Judea, beginning the Hasmonean dynasty. As Judah fell to Babylon in 585 BC, this was 585 years after the Israelites fell to Assyria in 745 BC. 159 BC, 3736 AM. The Roman Scipio Nasica instituted the first water clock, which divided the hours of the day and night. 1 Pliny, Natural History, Zoology. 153 BC, 3742 AM. Celtiberia revolts against Rome. The Romans attempt to assault Numantia, the Celtic capital of Celtiberia, but fail more than once. This was 792 years after Solomon sold 20 Israelite cities to Phoenicia in 945 BC, these people being the ancestors of the Celts in Iberia. This defeat of the Romans was the 600th year since the founding of Rome in 753 BC. It was 560 years since Judah was delivered by God from the Assyrians in 713 BC, and 432 years since the fall of Judah. 149 BC, 3746 AM. During an anti-Carthaginian speech in Rome, Cato the censor pulled out a ripe fig before the Senate and asked the other senators when they believed the fig had been plucked from the tree. All the senators agreed that it was very fresh, to which Cato answered, "Know this, it was plucked 2 days ago in Carthage. That's how near the enemy are to our walls." At once Rome initiated the Third Punic War. This was exactly 1080 years after the ancestors of the Romans, the Trojans, fell in the fall of Troy in 1229 BC. This year was 600 years after the Romans raped the Sabine women in 749 BC. And this was the 360th year of the Roman Republic in 509 BC. 1 Pliny, Natural History, Botany. 146 BC, 3749 AM. Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus conquered Carthage in the Third Punic War. He was named Africanus in commemoration of his victories over the Carthaginians. This Third Punic War was entirely unprovoked, but was a matter of Roman will to be supreme in the Mediterranean, to expand its foreign holdings and to rid itself of an archaic enemy. By this time Carthage could not match the resources of Rome, which had enslaved entire populations, sold off the people for profit and annexed their lands. It took 6 days of street fighting to finally subdue Carthage, 50,000 people surviving out of the 250,000 who defended the city against the Romans. The immense and very ancient library of Carthage was over 500,000 texts, many from ancient Phoenicia. The Romans destroyed the whole library, most of the records irretrievably lost. The 50,000 survivors are sold into the Mediterranean slave market, a lucrative source of Roman wealth. The city is burnt, buildings pulled down, and the fields are ripped up and ploughed with salt, so as to prevent the growth of crops. Many priceless works of antiquity were destroyed or stolen. With the fall of the last Semitic superpower of the Old World, only Judea of the Semitic world still continued under its own rulers. The fall of Carthage was 666 years after the founding of the city in 812 BC. Also in this year the Romans put an end to the last of Greek resistance. The city of Corinth is the last to stand up to the Roman beast. Corinth falls and the Romans put all the men to the sword. The women and children are gathered and sold as slaves. They ended the Achaean League and all of Greekdom was now under the Roman authority. The fact that both Greece and Carthage fell to Rome in the same year, 146 BC, denotes a common link, a connection between the Phoenician-descended people and the Ionian Danaan-descended peoples. Of course, this chronology has already demonstrated these links, i.e. the many Israelite migrations and assimilations. 1. Elder gods in antiquity. 2. A short history of the world. 3. The naked Olympics. 144 BC, 3751 AM. Despite that Rome now occupied Greece, the Greeks still hold their Olympic festival. Rome's first aqueduct is constructed, the length of 35 miles. This was provided for by Quintius Marcius, a praetor, and is called the Aqua Marcia. 1. The naked Olympics. 2. Pliny, Natural History, footnote 1. 143 BC, 3752 AM. Simon Maccabee becomes a Jewish hero by leading a successful revolt that freed Judea from Syrian control, Judea forming the Second Jewish Commonwealth. This was 3896 years since Earth adopted this new orbit around the Sun, between Venus and Mars, or 1948 plus 1948 years. Recall that Abraham was born in 1948 AM, 1947 BC, and that the modern state of Israel was begun in 1948 AD. 141 BC, 3754 AM. When pulling down the house of the Chinese philosopher Confucius, a copy of the ancient Shu King text was discovered to have been hidden in a wall. This text covers Chinese antiquities spanning back from before the flood concerning Chinese versions of Enoch and Noah, covering history to 721 BC. This year, 721 BC, happened to be the final year of Israel's existence, only Judah remaining after all the Israelites were gone into captivity. Noah was born in 2839 BC, or the year 1056 Annus Mundi, and incidentally, this was the year 1056 of the ancient Chinese calendar that began in 1197 BC. 139 BC, 3756 AM. In this year, Jewish ambassadors brought back from Rome a senatorial decree recognizing the independence of the Jewish state. Also, the first Jewish community was established in the Roman Empire. This was the 792nd year of the divided kingdom, and the 864th year from the establishment of the Davidic dynasty in 1003 BC. Also in this year, the ancient Chaldei, astrologers in Rome, also known as the Mathematici, were expelled from Rome and all of Italy. They had enjoyed a long-standing profession that dated at least back to the rule of the kings, 753 to 509 BC. The origin of the order of the Chaldei is traced back to 1555 BC, or 1416 years earlier, to the Chaldean astrologer Balaam of Mesopotamia, infamous in the biblical record. Balaam took up residence in Italia with Zepho the king, who was the grandson of Esau. Balaam lived 21 years in Italia until Zepho died in 1534 BC. Balaam was instructed in the arts and sciences of the Anunnaki, being from Babylonia. This year was 66 Jubilees after 3439 BC, when the Watchers descended to earth and taught mankind forbidden knowledge. The entire duration of the Roman government, from the founding of the city in 753 BC to the fall of Rome to the Germans in 476 AD, was 1229 years. This mirrored the fact that the ancestors of the Romans, the Trojans, fell in 1229 BC. The sum of 1229 is 614.5, 2 times over. This year of the expulsion of the Mathematici and the senatorial decree concerning the independence of Judea was the 614th year of Rome, and counting another 614.5 years into the future was 476 AD, fall of Rome. This year is the exact midpoint in Rome's history. 1. The Hitchhiker's Guide to Armageddon. 2. March of the Titans. 137 BC, 3758 AM. The Romans were defeated by the Celtiberians at Numantia in Spain. This was 744 years after the Israelites built Samaria in 881 BC. A capital city like Numantia was to the Celts. This was also 612 years after the Romans abducted the Sabine Celts in 749 BC. This was 576 years after the Judahites were delivered from the Assyrian army of Sennacherib in 713 BC at Jerusalem, the capital of Judah. As this was 612 years after the rape of the Sabines by the Romans. This was also 612 years to 476 AD, the fall of Rome, exactly 1224 years after the first contact of the Romans with the Celts, Gauls. 1 Tacitus, Annals of Imperial Rome. 135 BC, 3760 AM. An extremely bright comet appeared in the east, almost rivaling the sun with a spectacular tail, spanning a fourth of the sky according to Pompeius Trogus, as cited by Justin. It was said to appear at the birth of Mithridates, king of Pontus. Roman historian Justin wrote that the comet appeared over the Mediterranean for 70 days, and that it looked as if the whole sky was on fire. It is said that this same comet returned in 120 BC, The year Mithridates VI was crowned king of Pontus. Pontus was named after the father of Poseidon and Sidon, according to Phoenician historian Sanchoniathon. Velikovsky relates that Pontus was derived from Punt, the Egyptian designation for God's land. The Chinese of the Han dynasty claim that 2 comets were seen in this year with long war banner shapes, tails, seen for 70 days, and bronze coins minted by Mithridates depict the comet of 135 BC, which was also depicted upon a coin of King Tigranes II of Armenia. This comet was also described by Seneca. About this time, Hipparchus of Nicaea thrived. He coined the phrase precession of the equinox, said to be the first astronomer to understand and explain the phenomenon. He is thought to be the first to understand the true dimensions of the Earth, having taken the 60 divisions of the planet of Eratosthenes to design a globe of 360 divisions, degrees. Hipparchus is renowned as the father of astronomy in the Western world, because he is believed to have been the first to catalogue the stars. His index included 1080 fixed stars, which denotes that he understood some importance fixed to this arbitrary sum. He invented a system for measuring the magnitude, brightness of stars, which still serves as the basis for the modern system. He even calculated the first reasonably accurate distance to the moon. 1. The Poisoned King. 2. Ages in Chaos, Volume 1. 3. Ancient Mysteries. 6. Human Accomplishment. 133 BC, 3762 AM. After a long period of Celtiberian resistance against Rome, the Romans under Scipio Aemilianus invade Spain and attack Numantia with 60,000 troops. Unable to take Numantia, the Romans besiege it and starve the Celts into submission. They destroy the fortress city, but even this is a superficial victory, for the Celts would soon revolt again. On the other side of Gaulish Europe, in Phrygia, King Attalus died. The land-hungry Romans concoct a scheme to acquire Phrygia by claiming that in the will of King Attalus, the Phrygian king gave his kingdom to Rome. This tactic would later be adopted by the Roman Catholic Church in the forgery known as the Donation of Constantine. Near Phrygia in Asia Minor, the kingdom of Pergamum gave Rome a library of 200,000 scrolls, this beginning the Pergamum College in Rome. In this year we have Rome acquiring or destroying lands, property or lives of 3 different cultures, all racially descended from Israelites. The calendrics too bear this out. This was 14 years after the exodus of Israel in 1447 BC, which is 657 plus 657 years. Counting 657 years after 1447 BC, then was 657 BC, when the leading families of Corinth, founded by Ionian Israelites, migrated to Macedon, and counting another 657 years was 133 BC. Recall that the Ionians first settled in Asia Minor before crossing the Aegean to begin Ionian and Danaan dynasties in ancient Greece. This year was also 828 years after the temple was completed in Jerusalem in 961 BC, the temple having a complete library of the Torah scrolls and other ancient records. This was also the 3240th year of the Olmec calendar, begun in 3373 BC. 1. Elder gods in antiquity. 2. The Poisoned King. 132 BC, 3763 AM. A widespread slave revolt in Sicily was crushed by the Romans. Sicily was then a breadbasket to the Roman Empire. Sicily was formerly under the rule of Carthage, but with the Punic Wars over and the Romans supreme in the Mediterranean, the people of Sicily were reduced to slavery. 125 BC, 3770 AM. Judea defeats Idumea, Edom, and forces the Edomite population to convert to Judaism on point of death. The Jews are cursed for marrying Edom, according to the prophetic books. Edom is the people descended from Esau, the brother and enemy of Jacob, Israel. This was exactly 460 years after the fall of Judah in 585 BC, when Edom was jubilant over Judah's fate. 122 BC, 3773 AM. Mount Etna erupted according to Cicero. 1. Lucretius on the nature of the universe. 119 BC, 3776 AM. A comet appeared as recorded by the Chinese of the Han dynasty and the Mediterranean records with a long curving tail. This was during the first regnal years of King Mithridates VI of Pontus. Mithridates' birth was also heralded by the appearance of a comet, and already his people and those of neighbouring lands were regarding Mithridates as a curiosity. 1. The Poisoned King, 2 Ancient Mysteries. 118 BC, 3777 AM. During the consulship of Quintus Marcius and Marcus Porcius, according to Pliny, more than one sun appeared in the sky. This would have been the bright reflection of sunlight off the surface of a locally passing object. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 114 BC, 3781 AM. Historians report that in this year of the consulship of Achilleus and Porcius, there were occurrences of a reddish rain of a milky substance from the sky, and of the rain of blood. Pliny wrote that the blood rains were a frequent report from antiquity. 1. 3 Books of Occult Philosophy of Agrippa. 113 BC, 3782 AM. Pliny the Elder records that during this year in the consulship of Gaius Caecilius and Gnaeus Papirius, nocturnal suns appeared so bright they turned night into day. These would be large unknown bodies reflecting brightly the sun's light as they passed slightly beyond Earth's distance from the sun, so they could be brilliantly lit from the night side of the planet. This was the 3000th year of the Mayan calendar. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 110 BC, 3785 AM. Not satisfied with Carthaginian territories recently acquired 36 years prior, the Romans had invaded North Africa and were now attempting to take the kingdom of King Jugurtha. Led by General Spurius Albinus, a force of 100,000 men in a Roman army were defeated by the North Africans, a most humiliating defeat for Rome. 107 BC, 3788 AM. Roman reforms established a professional army of Rome. The Joshua Comet Group passed through the inner solar system. 1. Wars that changed the world. 103 BC, 3792 AM. During the third consulship of Marius, the people of Rome and Ameria and Tudor witnessed armies fighting in the sky with weapons, the East against the West, the army of the West put to flight. This was recorded by Pliny. This vision of armies in battle in the skies was also seen over Jerusalem in AD 70, when the Romans destroyed the city. This was 2208 years before Armageddon, when other armies will be fighting in the skies and on earth. And this year was also 3000 of the Vedic calendar. In this year, Aristobulus I assumed the title King of Judea of the Hasmonean dynasty at Jerusalem. Alexander Jannaeus is high priest. Aristobulus forcibly converts all of Galilee to Judaism, circumcision becoming compulsory. This was 828 years after the exodus of Israel in 1447 BC, and one period of judged time, 434 years, after Babylon fell to Persia in 537 BC, liberating the Jews. 1. The Poisoned King. 2. The Jesus Papers. 3. The Christ Conspiracy. 102 BC, 3793 AM. Marius of Rome defeated the Teutones, Germans, invading Gaul at that time. He then turned his attention to the Cimbri, also from the far north. This was 540 years after the Romans defeated the Sabines, Celts, at Mantrap Wood in 642 BC. 1. The Philosopher and the Druid. 101 BC, 3794 AM. Marius of Rome defeated the Cimbri that were invading from the north into Gaul. Also in this year Julius Caesar was born, a man that would alter the demographics of the ancient world, almost as much as did Alexander of Macedon. This year was 1776 years since the institution of the Abrahamic Covenant in 1877 BC. The Cimbri came from the Cimmerians and were the descendants of exiled Israelites deported into Assyria in 721 BC, or 620 years earlier. This was the 408th year of the Roman Republic, formed in 509 BC. and this counts down 576 years to the fall of Rome in 476 AD by the descendants of the Germans, Teutones and Cimbri. 1. The philosopher and the Druid. 94 BC, 3801 AM. Posidonius, educated at Athens under the Stoic philosopher Panaetius, travelled into the heart of Europe and ancient Gaul to study the Celts. This was the first kind of expedition of its kind. Priorly, the only information historians offered about the Celts, Gauls, was through second-hand sources of those who had come in contact with them. But Posidonius travelled far from home and civilization into the wilds of Europe. Many Celts and Gauls were Romanized or Grecianized, living among Romans and Greeks, but even they could not provide anything other than scant material. The Cimbri and Teutones were coming further and further south from the far north, and Posidonius wanted to write an account about these people. He lived among the Gauls for 3 years and has provided us some of the only actual records of Celtic life, laws, tradition, and cultural information on the Celts and their religious leaders known as the Druids. He recorded things that were already known as ancient Israelite institutions. One of these was the engagement of the heroic code, the best warrior openly challenging those of an opposing army to one-on-one combat. The Druids were a priestly college centrally located in Britain, but the Druids were all over Celtic Europe. Its graduates were sent out to all areas of the continent and were accepted with honour among their Celtic kin. There were 40 university centres in Britain, and they required a man to endure 20 years of training before carrying away a diploma. The Druidic faith was the purest form and closest in connection to the ancient Israelite worship of God, the unity in Trinity. In Druidism, there were no idols, no temples, like the groves of Baal and Asherah, it being a spiritual worship. One of the members of the pre-Christian Druidic Trinity was Yesu, Jesus. The Druids maintained traditions of a great flood, a war in heaven, the 360-degree circle and 7-day week. At some time during his travels, Posidonius witnessed an eclipse of the sun that allowed him to see a faraway comet near the sun. 1. The philosopher and the Druid. 3. Post-captivity names of Israel. 4. St. Paul in Britain. 6. Introduction to comets. 92 BC, 3803 AM. Earthquake and volcanic activity afflict Italy, killing livestock and felling many rural buildings according to Pliny. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 89 BC, 3806 AM. An earthquake in Asia Minor destroyed the city of Apamea, a Jewish community. In this year, King Nicomedes IV of Bithynia invaded the kingdom of Pontus of Mithridates at the suggestion of a Roman official, starting the Mithridatic War. Nicomedes, named after Nicdem of Ugarit from distant antiquity, where the Ionians, descended from Israelites in 855 BC, were expelled at the coming of the Assyrians. And 190 years earlier in 279 BC, the region under Bithynia absorbed a massive population of post-exilic Israelite Gauls. Both Bithynia and Pontus were kin, distantly, having been founded by peoples descended from the migrating Israelites. Also in this year, Roman citizenship extended to all people living in Italy who were free. This was 792 years after founding of Israelite capital of Samaria in 881 BC. 1. The Poison King. 88 BC, 3807 AM. King Mithridates of Pontus arranged a series of secret meetings all throughout Asia Minor, in the greatest executed conspiracy in recorded history. No leader or organiser has ever executed flawlessly a scheme of the magnitude demonstrated here. All throughout the cities of Asia Minor occupied by the Romans, the local people, descended from Ionians, Danaan, Gauls, Phoenicians and Greeks, rose up on a certain predetermined day in spring and killed every Roman man, woman and child. In the massacre, the Romans claim to have lost 80,000 people, but some historians estimate the losses at closer to 150,000. They were given no mercy, even those who ran into the temple seeking asylum were killed. These were largely Roman businessmen and their families, traders and slavers occupying western Turkey, the new Roman province of Asia. The people abhorred the Romans because of their barbaric practices, especially the Roman slave trade. People forced into slavery and sold were branded with hot irons on their foreheads like cattle, separated from families, and this fate could be anyone save for a Roman citizen. This was not a military campaign, but executed by the common people, who hated Rome's taxations and oppressive institutions. Rome, already racked by civil war, was shocked and terrified, suffering immense financial loss from Mithridates' massacre. This could not be left without reprisal, and Rome sent the general Sulla to deal with the problem of Mithridates, Rome's greatest enemy since Hannibal. On a day with a clear blue sky, a loud noise issued from the sky over Rome. 1. The Poison King. 87 BC, 3808 AM. A comet appeared, the Romans perceiving this as an omen of doom. A shower of black ashes fell upon Greece. Mithridates' armies moved into Greece, freeing the mainland Greeks from the presence of the hated Romans. Mithridates extended his domains from Pontus by the Black Sea and Asia Minor, allied to the fearsome Scythians, and with Armenia and the nations from the Danube to the Euphrates. His generals Metrophanes and Archelaus sacked and destroyed Roman-occupied Delos, freeing thousands of slaves. 20,000 were killed in the slaver city, and the wives and children of Romans were in turn sold into slavery. After Mithridates' forces pulled out, Sulla of Rome invaded Greece and had the temples and oracles of the Greeks sacked. Olympia, the temple of Zeus, of Asclepius at Epidaurus, and Delphi, to the horror of the Greeks. These ancient treasuries were inviolable. Not even Xerxes of Persia in 481 to 479 BC looted them. Sulla begins his siege of Athens. As the ancient Israelites migrate across Asia and Europe, many groups would stop and settle in different regions. In 807 BC, a group stopped and founded Macedon, exactly 720 years before this Mithridatic war with Rome, this being the 666th year of the founding of Rome, 753 BC. This year was 460 years after the Temple of Delphi burnt down in 547 BC. Alexander Jannaeus, now king of Judea, gathered 800 Pharisaic dissidents. Pharisees were opposed to Grecianization of Judea and had them crucified. While they were alive, he had their wives and children gathered before them and their throats slit. 1. The Poison King. 6. The Christ Conspiracy. 86 BC, 3809 AM. The Roman legions under Sulla slaughtered the city of Athens, except for those that escaped by sea. Athens is sacked in this the 690th year of the Olympiad calendar, or 138 times 5. At Chaeronea, the Romans were vastly outnumbered against the 120,000 under Mithridates' general Archelaus. The combined army of Pontus, Asia Minor, Greeks and Armenia were defeated by Sulla's legions. Tens of thousands were captured and surrendered, and only 10,000 escaped. After 136 years outside the inner solar system, the Romanid Apocalypse comet group passed over the ecliptic and enters the inner system in a long debris train. In this year, the consulship of Lucius Valerius and Gaius Marius, an object like a burning shield, blazed across the sky from west to east toward the sunset, giving off sparks as it travelled. This was 252 years after 338 BC, when all of Greece was subdued under Macedon. 1. The Poison King. 3. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 83 BC, 3812 AM. The return of Sulla from Greece saw him turned into a ruthless dictator who oppressed Rome and Italy. He began executing all those who opposed his presence in the city and grabbed for power. Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote that the massacre of Sulla surpassed the massacre of Mithridates. The capital of Rome burned in a fire, and the ancient books of the Sibyl were destroyed, the official copies used by the Senate. But other copies had been made and spread abroad. This was the year 670 of Rome, and 666 years after Rome abducted and raped the Sabines in 749 BC. 1. The Poison King. 2. Prophets of Doom. 81 BC, 3814 AM. By this date, Sulla, dictator of Rome, had slaughtered 63,000 Romans, mostly followers of his rival Marius. His reign was viewed at the time and afterward by the Romans as the greatest catastrophe to the Republic. This was the year 672 of Rome. Half of 1344, or 8064 months. 1. The Poison King. 78 BC, 3817 AM. At 60 years old, a horrifying disease overtook Sulla. His bowels rotted and flesh was full of worms. Teams of servants tried to scrape away the worms, but this availed nothing. He died miserably. 1. The Poison King. 76 BC, 3819 AM. There is a major earthquake in Italy. In Spain, the Romans are defeated in a series of battles by Sertorius. 75 BC, 3820 AM. Julius Caesar, 26 years old, is kidnapped by pirates in the Aegean on his way to study oratory under Apollonius Molon, according to Suetonius. 1. Caesar against the Celts. 73 BC, 3822 AM. Roman general Lucullus marched to meet an army of Mithridates of Pontus at Otriae. Historians claim that from a clear blue sky a flaming object appeared and fell to the ground to crash directly between the two armies. Shocked, the armies separated, and the meteorite was still large when found, in the shape of a storage jar. Also in this year as an ex-gladiator of Thracia, now trained as a military auxiliary for the Romans, named Spartacus, a slave, began a slave revolt with about 600 slaves. Soon his uprising gained momentum, and he led a force of 70,000 slaves in Campania, gaining a few victories over Roman forces that tried to quell the revolt. The Thracians were originally settlers from Thebes, related to Cadmus, Phoenician, who came from overseas, from Palestine. They were a red-haired, blue-eyed people according to Ionian philosopher Xenophanes. This trait, red hair, was also a distinct feature of the early Hellenes. In fact, the Thracians worshipped Zalmoxis, the saviour, who promised eternal life to his people. He was a god of resurrection, and his name Zalmoxis means God of Moses. The Romans enslaved male populations in hostile territories as a measure of controlling the population. The Greeks abhorred slavery. In fact, slavery was never a common Greek institution. The previous Middle East rulers before the Macedonian Empire were the Persians, and under Persian rule the Israelites thrived. The ancient Persian religion forbade slavery. Rome, adopting the institution of slavery from African influence, from Carthage and Libya or Egypt. Babylonia was an empire built upon slavery, but the contacts between Babylon and Rome were almost non-existent. Spartacus had gained historic fame, his name known all around the world, with few realizing that this Thracian was of the blood of Israel. A massive wave of Israelites sailed off to Aegean shores in 1369 BC, those later called Ionians, Danaan and Hellenes, this being 1296 years before the slave revolt. 1296 is also 648 plus 648. Counting 648 years after 1369 BC was 721 BC, when the last of the 10 tribes of Israel were deported into Assyria, and 648 more years was the slave revolt in 73 BC. As the year 672 since the Assyrian deportation of Israel began in 745 BC, this was 8064 months. This was also the 3300th year of the Olmec calendar. 1. The Poison King. 3. Hyperspace. 4. The Greek myths. 5. The Christ conspiracy. 6. The origin of Greek civilization. 70 BC, 3825 AM. Roman general Marcus Crassus put down the slave revolt led by Spartacus, gathered the slaves and returned most of them to their masters. Their masters punished them, many no doubt killed, tortured and sold off to other fates. Crassus kept 6,000 slaves whose masters could not be found or discovered, and crucified them all down the length of the Appian Way, a highway in Italy. Sertorius in Spain was shown the crypt of a giant named Antaeus, the skeletal remains of a man who stood 6 cubits high. This indicates that he had stood 108 inches high, as the archaic cubit was 18 inches, 9 foot tall. 1. Natural history, Pliny. 2. Secret cities of old South America. 69 BC, 38:26 am. A comet is recorded by the Chinese. A major earthquake in Syria destroyed many cities, killing approximately 170,000 people. Roman general Lucullus invades Armenia with a force of 15 to 20,000 soldiers who routed an opposing force of 300,000. The combined armies of Tigranes of Armenia and Mithridates. Tigranes refused to follow the instructions of his ally Mithridates on how best to fight the Romans, and for this he was forced to fight a defensive war and lost. This Roman victory against incredible odds was the 684th year of Rome, since 753 BC and the 440th year of the Republic of Rome, established in 509 BC. In the year 603 BC, Israelites were migrating away from the northern and eastern Assyrian frontiers to settle the Balkans. From the Balkans, splinter groups set out to settle further west and north into Asia and Europe. This was 540 years before this date, and this was when Armenia was settled by descendants of Israelites who had lived in captivity among the Persians. Even today, the people of Armenia still speak a dialect of Iranic. This year was also 1300 years after the Danaan Israelites set out to settle in the Aegean and Peloponnesus in 1369 BC, and 1296 years after 1365 BC, when another Israelite wave of fleets arrived in ancient Greece and Asia Minor. 1. Introduction to comets. 2. The Poison King. 4. The Aryan race. 67 BC, 38:28 am. The Romans occupied the kingdom of Pontus. King Mithridates with an army of Pontus, Armenians, Scythian allies and others invaded Pontus and fought against 2 Roman legions. Again, here occurs yet another odd meteorological phenomenon in the life of Mithridates. A comet appeared the year of his birth, another comet in the year he became king of Pontus, and later a meteorite struck the ground between the Roman army and his own host, stopping a battle. Now, in 67 BC, between the Roman camp and that of Mithridates, a terrible tornado appeared, and Appian wrote that such a whirlwind was unknown in living memory. There were casualties of both animals and men in both camps. The Senate in Rome gives Pompey unprecedented power to carry out what the Romans called the Pirate War in the Mediterranean, according to Tacitus. The war actually began in 68 BC, and Pompey was sent out with 270 warships and 120,000 soldiers, with 4,000 cavalry. The Romans painted the conflict as an expedition against pirates, but this masked the true campaign. The Romans sought total Mediterranean dominance, but there were strong pockets of resistance spread across the islands. For a long time, piracy was sanctioned by the enemies of Rome, and even funded to disrupt Roman shipping, free slaves from Roman galleys, and foil all naval plans of the Romans. So successful was this loosely confederated campaign that the Romans had had enough, and Pompey ended most of it. By this time in history, the thousands of islands of the Mediterranean and Aegean were populated by descendants of Israelites, or peoples with high concentration of Israelite blood. By this date, the ancient Hebrew prophecies declaring that Israel will occupy the isles of the world had come true, from the Black Sea to Gibraltar. Pompey captured or destroyed 846 pirate vessels and occupied Crete, making it a Roman province. This was 1380 years after the exodus of Israel in 1447 BC, and the 864th year since Israel and Judah split into the divided kingdom in 931 BC. This was also 1344 years after Israel invaded and took the country of Argob and Bashan from the giants in 1411 BC, and 1188 years after 1255 BC, when the Danaan Israelite dynasty of Mycene was founded in the Peloponnesus. 1. The Poison King. 2. Tacitus, Annals of Imperial Rome. 4. Pliny, Natural History, Zoology. 66 BC, 38:29 am. Pompey of Rome defeated Mithridates of Pontus, but Mithridates escaped. Pompey continued his conquest of the East. In this, the final year of the Romanid apocalypse comet chain, Pliny the Elder reported an unusual occurrence during the consulship of Gnaeus Octavius and Gaius Scribonius. A star appeared over Italy, and a spark fell from this star, the spark growing in size as it drew near to the earth, becoming the size of the moon. It appeared to be enshrouded in clouds and departed as if on fire. This was witnessed and recorded by the proconsul Silanus and his entourage. 1. The Poisoned King. 2. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 65 BC, 38:30 AM. Tigranes of Armenia surrendered to Pompey of Rome, giving Rome the territories of Mesopotamia, Syria, and Phoenicia. This was 1300 years after Israelites migrated into the Peloponnesus and Aegean in 1365 BC, and interestingly, 1300 years after the fall of Rome in 476 AD was the year when the descendants of Israel founded the Empire of Adoption, known as the United States, in 1776 AD. This was the 444th year since the founding of Rome in 753 BC, and 520 years since the fall of Judah in 585 BC. Amazingly, this was 684 years after the Romans abducted and raped the Sabines in 749 BC, which itself was 684 years after 1433 BC, when the anciently famous King Latinus of Italia died, succeeded by King Albinus, 1. The Poisoned King. 63 BC, 38:32 AM. Powerful earthquakes ruined Asia Minor as recorded by Cassius Dio, Livy and Orosius. A quake felt as far as Rome. Pompey continued his war of conquest into the east. Rome had become the devouring wolf, a terrible beast and scourge among nations. The Romans were propelled by plunder, a creature that found that its own survival compelled them to turn against allies, invade new territories, impose heavier taxes, enslave whole populations in order to pay the administrative costs of ruling others, selling off whole populations into servitude, and terrible deaths as galley slaves, dungeon, mines, and brothels. Countries were raped for their resources. The Romans created a monster of war, carnage and misery, unable to cease its atrocities or it would implode. The whole world its enemy, only unending war and conquest could give Rome security at home, as its provinces were ever bloody battlefields. From a biblical perspective, Rome epitomized the spirit of Esau, brother and hater of Jacob, Israel and Judah. This was the 690th year of Rome, or 138 times 5. The quakes occurred in the 250th year of the Syrian-Greek Seleucid calendar, or 3,000 months. In fulfilling the role of Esau, the Romans now attack and overlord over Judea, as Pompey enters the region unopposed and creates the Roman province of Judea and Idumea, Edom, ending the Jewish Hasmonean dynasty. The occupation of Jerusalem by the Romans was prophesied in Daniel's works. This year of 63 BC was the epicentral year of Daniel's prophecy of the four empires, dreamed by Nebuchadnezzar II, which began in 603 BC when the Babylonians invaded and occupied Jerusalem 540 years before 63 BC, when Pompey of Rome invaded. 63 BC began a 540 years countdown to the fall of Rome in 476 AD to the Germans, descendants of the Cimmerian and Scythian Israelites. This total period from 63 BC seems to be divided in 1080 years of the Four Empires prophecy. This was also the year of Octavian's birth, the first emperor, starting 540 years before Rome's last emperor. This year, 63 BC, was 864 years after the Egyptians sacked Jerusalem and the Temple in 927 BC. And this was the 868th year of the divided kingdom, 434 being a period of judged time. This was also 1344 years after the exodus of Israel in 1447 BC. Sadly, the great enemy and famous Mithridates of Pontus, feared and hated by the Romans, died an ignominious death in this year. Having lost his kingdom, his own son, seeking favour with Rome, trapped him in a tower where he had sought refuge with his family. Mithridates drank poison, ending his life, rather than allowing the Romans to take him alive. In this he had followed the example of Hannibal. Southern Syria and Samaria were also under the rule of Rome. The Jews were openly hostile toward the Samaritans. Jews refused to travel through Samaria, lands formerly occupied by the 10 tribes of Israel, going around and over the Jordan River. The Samaritans were a people first deported from Assyria to occupy the land of Israel. But over the centuries, more and more people descended from ancient Israelites wandered back into the land, especially the Gauls. The Samaritans were possessors of the Torah, avid adherents to the Old Testament faith, the laws of Moses, and they claimed to possess copies of the ancient books of the Hebrews, older than those had by the Jews. But the Jews would not socialize nor validate their claims. The Jewish prejudice against Samaritans was extreme, the Jews even refusing generous offers of money and assistance in helping to rebuild the temple. Even at this early date in Jewry, Jews originated with Judahites in Babylonian captivity. One's beliefs were not nearly as important as one's ethnicity. Samaritans were not allowed to serve in Jewish synagogues, in courts, and everywhere the Samaritans found themselves ridiculed. Jews went to the extreme of popularizing the doctrine that there was no place in heaven for Samaritans. The animosity against the Samaritans was ancestral and stemmed from 931 BC, the Israelite civil war that created the divided kingdom between Israel to the north and Judah to the south. 1. The poisoned king. 3. History in quotations. 5. Christ, the power and the passion. 60 BC, 3835 AM. Approximate date for when Diodorus Siculus visited Giza and studied the Great Pyramid. This historian wrote that the structure was covered in white casing blocks that were, quote, entire and without the least decay, unquote. He wrote that the earth could not be too old or that mankind could not have been on earth for very long, perplexing as to why the Theban and Trojan Wars, 1244 to 1229 BC, seemed to be the extent of Greek history and knowledge of the past. It is to be noted that the reason why there appeared no historical knowledge possessed by ancient Greeks is because the ancient Greeks were in fact early migrating Israelites from the Ionian and Danaan migrations. Within a century and a half of the appearance of these migrants occurred the Theban War, 1244 BC, and the Trojan War, 1239 to 1229 BC. In this year, the first triumvirate of Rome was established between Pompey, Marcus Crassus, and Julius Caesar. It would last until 53 BC. 1. The Great Pyramid, its divine message. 2. Diodorus. 59 BC, 3836 AM. Titius Livy was born, he died in AD 17, a Roman historian who composed 142 books from source materials as old as Rome itself. His masterpiece of Rome's early history is still studied today. 58 BC, 3837 AM. Roman general Julius Caesar conquers Gaul, France, gaining immediate fame throughout the Roman Empire. Roman historian Strabo, born in this year, died AD 25. 55 BC, 3840 AM. Julius Caesar of Rome invades Britain with thousands of troops in the first recorded transatlantic naval invasion in Roman history, exactly 2,000 years before the United States conducted the most extensive transatlantic naval invasion in world history in 1944 AD, with Operation Overlord storming the beaches of Normandy, Gaul, where Caesar took off from invading Britain. After crossing the English Channel, Caesar's forces were opposed by Cassibelanus of Britain with 4,000 troops and war chariots that repelled the Romans. So fierce was the British resistance that in 3 weeks the Romans had only advanced 7 miles, and the Romans were forced to retreat. Caesar did not discover barbarians, but a land full of civilized people rich in agriculture, livestock, and thickly populated. Caesar wrote his famous Gallic War, describing that the Celts of Gaul were constantly at war with the Germans north of the Rhine. Interestingly, this would soon be the fate of Britain, for in about 5 centuries the German families of the Saxons, Jutes, and Angles would be invading the Isles. The British referred to themselves as the Cymri or Cimbri, which we have already found derived from the Cimeri, Scythians of old. The designation of British denoted their Hebrew origin. Brith, covenant, and ish, man, or Brithish, being British, covenant man. This year was 2160 before Armageddon, and 5184 of Anunnaki chronology. It was also 2760 Anno Pyramid, and 1584 years after 1639 BC, when Manasseh and Ephraim were adopted into the family of Israel. This is remarkable because Manasseh and Ephraim are the future prophetic Israelite-descended empires of Great Britain and the United States. This year was 1332 years, 666 plus 666, after 1387 BC, when the kingdom of the Chittim in Italia invaded Britannia, Britain, clearly a repeat in history. This was also the 1200th year of the Danaan dynasty of Mycenae, founded in 1255 BC, the Danaan having sailed away from the Peloponnesus in fleets after the collapse of the dynasty as the Dorians invaded, many making their way to Britain. This was also the 690th year since the Israelites were deported into Assyria in 745 BC, and 666 years after the last of the 10 tribes were deported in 721 BC. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 2. St. Paul in Britain. 3. A History of Civilization, Volume 1. 5. The Bible's Fraud. 54 BC, 3841 AM. Julius Caesar, smarting from his inability to conquer Britain the year before, invades Britain again with even more troops and 1,000 ships. His campaign lasted from May 10th to September the 10th. He had more success this time, however. The Britons were mighty and fought back valiantly until the campaign was a stalemate. Caesar was entertained by the Celtic leader Cassibelanus, but no British nobles were taken captive, and when Caesar left Britain he left no Romans behind. Though a draw, the egoistic Caesar recorded it as a victory. On the far eastern end of the Roman Empire, the Roman general Marcus Crassus also sought to expand the Roman territory, and like Caesar, he too found that Rome had a limit. He fought against the Parthians and found them to be organised and undefeatable. Iron that looked spongy rained from the sky over Lucania, and the people interpreted this to be a bad omen for their faraway soldiers, for many Lucanians were serving under Marcus Crassus. This is the approximate date for the death of Lucretius Carus, who had written On the Nature of the Universe, a poem of over 7,400 lines focused on demonstrating that the entire universe is composed of atoms. Lucretius remarked that if the world is truly old, then why does the sum of Greek history span back only to the Theban and Trojan wars? This was also a question posed by Diodorus Siculus, c. 60 BC. Lucretius also wrote of the Great Flood, when races of men were overwhelmed, declaring that the entire history of the world was one of earthquakes that caused cities with their citizens to sink to the bottom of the seas. Lucretius' most incredible statement was that some unknown body, not the moon, passes over the surface of the sun and darkens the earth at a fixed time. Evidently, Lucretius had available to him historic records and accounts of Phoenix and Nibiru, as did Pliny, Aristarchus, Thales, and Atreus. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 2. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 3. Lucretius on the Nature of the Universe, Book 5. 53 BC, 3842 AM. Roman general Crassus led an army of 7 legions, between 28,000 to 42,000 soldiers, with 4,000 cavalry and also auxiliaries, into northern Babylonia, and in the Battle of Carrhae, Haran of old, they were slaughtered by the Parthians, a defeat shocking the ancient Roman world. The king of Parthia had molten gold poured down General Marcus Crassus' throat. The Parthians were an admixture of Persians, Medes and Scythians, all ruled by the Sacs or descendants of Israel, Beth Sak, house of Isaac. Haran was the ancient hometown of Abraham, the patriarch of all the Israelites, Haran the origin of the Hurrians. This military defeat was 700 years after the founding of Rome in 753 BC, and 828 years after the Israelite capital city of Samaria was built in 881 BC. 1. Ancient Mysteries. 2. The Poisoned King. 51 BC, 3844 AM. By this year Rome had conquered all the Gauls from Galatia in Asia Minor to Celtiberia in Spain and Cisalpine Gaul, this being 670 years after the last of the 10 tribes of Israel in 721 BC were deported by Assyria. From this year onwards the only free Celtic kingdoms were in Britain, Scotland and Ireland. 49 BC, 3846 AM. During the civil war of Rome, a comet appeared, this being during the passage of the Romanid Apocalypse comet group. Julius Caesar marched his legions over the Rubicon and into Italy, an act forbidden by Roman law, which mandated that a general's army had to stay camped within the boundaries of the general's assigned command. Having crossed the Rubicon on his way to fight Pompey and Rome, Caesar remarked, "The die is cast." This was 700 years after Rome raped the Sabines in 749 BC, and 400 years after the collapse of the 10 torrents of Rome and institution of the 12 tables of the law in public in 449 BC. This was also 460 years since the founding of the Republic of Rome in 509 BC, and half of this was 230 years, or 279 BC, when Italy was losing battles to Pyrrhus of Epirus. In this year Rome extended Roman citizenship privileges to the Celts of Gaul. 1. Pliny, Natural History, Universe and the World. 2. A Short History of the World. 3. The Philosopher and the Druid. 48 BC, 3847 AM. Julius Caesar defeats Pompey at Pharsalos for the supremacy of Rome. His dictatorship is heralded by many as the end of the Republic. Caesar then invades Egypt, burns his own fleet of ships and the Library of Alexandria. Most of the texts are lost, but many are spirited out, the most important by scribes and stewards. This was exactly 744 years after 792 BC, when the Ethiopic dynasty of Egypt began. 47 BC, 3848 AM. Cleopatra VII, aided by her new Roman lover Julius Caesar, is reinstated as co-ruler of Egypt with her brother Ptolemy XIV after a civil war with her brother Ptolemy XIII. Cleopatra and her brothers were of the Macedonian line, Cleopatra named after Alexander the Great's sister. Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt, was fluent in her native Macedonian, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Arabic, Syrian, Parthian, Median and Hebrew. In fact, no less than a quarter of the population of Alexandria was Jewish, and the majority of her tax police were Jewish, a thorn in the side of the local Greeks. This was 1400 years after the destruction and collapse of Egypt in 1447 BC and escape of the Israelites in the Exodus. The beginning of Cleopatra's reign here was 500 years after the Greeks. She, being Grecian, suffered the loss of the Temple of Delphi when it burned down in 547 BC, when they requested aid from Pharaoh of Egypt to rebuild it, and he sent treasure and craftsmen enough to restore the Delphic oracle. This was also 880 years after Egypt invaded Judah and sacked the temple in 927 BC. 1. Alexander of Macedon. 2. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 46 BC, 3849 AM. Caesar invades the North African coast and defeats Numidia. Prince Juba too is taken to Rome, where he is brought up to be a Roman soldier and scholar of renown. He is the son of Juba, a direct descendant of the Carthaginians and Phoenicians, from a long lineage of kings going back 1,000 years to the first African Phoenician settlements. Caesar modifies the calendar after the calculations of Alexandrian scholar and astronomer Sosigenes, who redesigned a more modern calendar to have yearly periods of 365 days, with an intercalary day added every 4 years, leap year, as opposed to the old Roman model of 355 days a year, with an extra month of 22 days or 23 days added every other year. The seasons were out of alignment, so Caesar instituted a 446-day year, known as the Year of Confusion. Though this newer model was adopted in 46 BC, the new calendar did not begin until after the Year of Confusion, which added 81 days to the year. Thus 45 BC was the start of the Roman Julian calendar, 1. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 45 BC, 3850 AM. At the end of the Year of Confusion, the Roman Julian calendar began. Caesar ended his Egyptian campaign and returned to Rome, bringing Queen Cleopatra. This was purely to exhibit her in his triumph. This year was 1152 years after the start of the Chinese calendar in 1197 BC. This was 700 years after the Israelites were deported into Assyria, a people whose descendants would forever be Rome's mightiest enemies. This was 540 years after the fall of Judah in 585 BC. 1. The 48 Laws of Power. 44 BC, 3851 AM. As the forces of the Roman general Mark Antony besieged the army of Decimus Brutus at Mutina, a storm of shooting stars lit up the sky, and Pliny records that there appeared a second sun with their own. Caesar had instituted many legal reforms, strengthened the empire, but his adversaries were many, and they claimed he strengthened the empire at the expense of the Republic, his rule being a tyranny. He had restructured the government, reformed the calendar, and was popular with the people due to an extraordinary military career of 50 battles. However, Caesar's civil war to gain the supremacy had cost the empire 1,192,000 lives in battle. Julius Caesar had a statue erected of himself with an inscription that read, "To the unconquerable God." This was done in the same year that a conspiracy against him was executed with success. Caesar made it known that he intended to follow the footsteps of Alexander the Great of Macedon. He was going to invade Parthia, but this revelation came just before his untimely death. Dio Cassius recorded that a comet then appeared. The comet lasted 7 days as Mount Etna also erupted. The sun grew dim for the remainder of the year, dust veil and volcanic ash, and crops were devastated. Virgil wrote that right before Caesar was killed, the sun was veiled in rust red. This sun darkening was also recorded by Pliny. Caesar was approached by many senators who then drew their daggers and all stabbed Caesar. 1. Pliny Natural History, Universe and the World. 2. Pliny Natural History, Zoology. 3. A Short History of the World. 4. The Lost Treasure of King Juba. 5. Caesar against the Celts, History in Quotations. 43 BC, 3852 AM. The second triumvirate is formed between the military rulers Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, the famous lover of Cleopatra of Egypt, Marcus Lepidus, and Gaius Octavius, Octavian. These three contenders for supremacy would kill all hopes for the restoration of the Republic. Their rivals and political dissidents ruthlessly hunted down and assassinated. One of these victims was the famous and brilliant orator Cicero, Marcus Tullius Cicero, renowned as the most famous orator ever. His books and technique are still studied and taught today. Cicero had been a student of the Greek philosopher-historian Posidonius of Rhodes, who had documented his studies on the Celts. Cicero also theorized that there existed another continent over the Atlantic. Cicero publicly voiced his desire for the restoration of the Republic. This year marked the birth of Ovid, author of Metamorphoses, and other works preserved from fragments of ancient cosmological writings. Ovid too would fall into political disfavour and suffer at the hands of a Roman emperor. A fiery comet was recorded to have appeared in the western sky. 1. The Greek Myths. 2. Pliny Natural History. 42 BC, 3853 AM. Agents of the triumvirate hunt down and kill Marcus Brutus and Gaius Cassius, the two principal assassins of Julius Caesar. Pliny records the appearance of a strange sun along with our own. This was probably the reflection of a disintegrating comet of the dying Sodom-Trojan apocalypse comet group. 1. Pliny Natural History, Universe and the World. 39 BC, 3856 AM. Rome's first public library was founded, called the Hall of the Goddess of Liberty, or Atrium Libertatis, founded by Asinius Pollio. The calendrics for this year bear out that something very important occurred in this year, somewhere in the world. The calendrics indicate that this event would have transpired outside the boundaries of present Rome, or the lands inhabited by Israel's descendants. 38 BC, 3857 AM. Rome invades and conquers Spain. King Herod of Idumea feared the Jewish Hasmoneans because they were allied to Parthians in the east, a people partially descended from Israelites that he had fought against in 40 BC. Herod fled Jerusalem and went to Rome, where the Roman Senate declared him king of Judea. Herod left the Senate building with none other than Mark Antony, Roman ruler of the east, and Octavian, ruler of the west. Herod and Antony became close colleagues despite Cleopatra's intrigues against Herod, for she wanted Idumea to be under Egypt. The relationship between Herod of Idumea, Edom, and Rome is curious because the connection between Edom and Italy was ancient, going back to the days of Zepho, grandson of Esau, the enemy and hater of Jacob, Israel, 14 centuries earlier. 37 BC, 3858 AM. Herod of Idumea invades Judea and takes Jerusalem after a siege that lasted 5 months. Mark Antony had provided Herod a large Roman force to accomplish this. When the city fell, Herod executed 45 members of the Jewish Sanhedrin, destroying its influence. The Sanhedrin would not emerge again for 42 years, in AD 6. The last Jewish king, Antigonus, was sent to Mark Antony at Antioch and beheaded. Herod's reign, backed by Rome, is secure and the Hasmonean dynasty is finished. This year is 108 years to 70 AD, when the Romans will destroy Jerusalem, kill over 1 million Jews and sell off over 90,000 of them as slaves. 1. The Bible fraud. 2. The Jesus Papers. 3. Secrets of Time. 31 BC, 3864 AM. The forces of Octavian from the Western Roman Empire defeated the forces of Mark Antony of the Eastern Roman Empire at the Battle of Actium. During this naval battle off the coast of Greece, there occurred an earthquake that killed 10,000 people initially, but resulted in 30,000 fatalities all told. Planet Phoenix entered the inner solar system at this time and nearly transited but did not, completing its 138 years orbit and causing the earthquake, as it had done so many times before. Octavian became ruler of the whole Roman Empire, and Herod, who was formerly allied closely to Mark Antony, quickly came before Octavian without wearing his crown, humbly, gaining the affinity of Octavian. This was the 1224th year after the founding of the Danaan dynasty of Mycenae in 1255 BC, the 900th year of the divided kingdom since 931 BC. This was 5208 Anunnaki chronology, or 744 times 7, and 2208 years after the flood. While 31 BC and the near transit of Phoenix saw only an historic political change in the Mediterranean world, on the other side of the planet in the Yucatan, it brought the end of the Olmec civilization. The Olmec employed the long count calendar before the Maya inherited it. The last known date of the Olmeca was found on a date stela in the ruins of Tres Zapote on Stela C, a date equivalent to our 31 BC. The ruination that occurred throughout the Yucatan may have occurred just days, weeks or months after this inscription was made. 1. Josephus Antiquities, the Jewish War. 2. The Lost Realms, Strangers from Across the Sea, Sitchin. 30 BC, 3865 AM. Octavian invades Egypt, the largest power base supporting Mark Antony, the kingdom of his lover Cleopatra. Mark Antony commits suicide, the entire Eastern Roman Empire now forfeited to Octavian. Cleopatra is arrested and taken into custody and unsuccessfully attempts to seduce Octavian. She is watched closely by his men, fearing she would commit suicide before allowing herself to be paraded through Rome in a triumph and executed. Cleopatra was not Egyptian, but a woman descended from Macedonians of the Ptolemaic dynasty. She was named after the sister of Alexander of Macedon, but the name Cleopatra is ancient, derived from the Homeric masculine name of the Achaean hero Patroclus. Cleopatra is the reverse. Patroclus died at the hands of the Trojans. The coincidence here lies in that Cleopatra, a woman of Greek origin like Patroclus, dies in the hands of the Romans, descendants of the Trojans. The story circulated was that she allowed venomous snakes to bite her to death, but rumours have persisted that Octavian ordered her death in custody. This year marked the total end of dynastic Egypt. Egypt from this time forward would be under Rome, then the control of Europeans, and then Islam. 28 BC, 3867 AM. Roman historian Marcus Varro died, much of his chronology of the ancient world preserved in the writings of Augustan. Varro's history provided us the unique testimony of the ancients on Phoenix for 1687 BC, mistaking Venus for what was Phoenix. 27 BC, 3868 AM. Gaius Octavius, Octavian, becomes Augustus Caesar, effectively beginning the Roman Empire. Octavian was not as Julius Caesar, not given to be regarded as a deity nor a king. He resisted Cleopatra, whereas Cleopatra had seduced both Caesar and Mark Antony. Octavian, having total power, instead gave back to the Roman Senate their former freedoms and powers of office, lifted many oppressive measures instituted against the people, and the grateful Senate convened and gave Octavian more power than he could have ever obtained by force, making him Augustus Caesar, the first of the emperors of Rome. An interesting coincidence is found in that Octavian's name means the eighth, and this is indeed the role he fulfilled. For as the 7 kings of the monarchy of Rome exercised total power over Rome, so did Octavian the Eighth, a title very prominent in the prophetic writings that circulated in those days, concerning the last days that took their final form, known as the Apocalypse, or Book of the Revelation of John. The Eighth was a title for the Antichrist, who will exercise total power over the world. As the Western world produces its first emperor, an earthquake in Egypt knocks down one of the 2 great statues of Memnon. This year was 1872 years after the nations were dispersed at the Babel disaster in 1899 BC, and 1380 years after Israel became a nation in 1407 BC. 1. A short history of the world. 25 BC, 3870 AM. After Rome conquered the North African lands, they had been renamed Africa Nova. Juba II, with his new bride, 15-year-old Cleopatra Selene, were married and declared king and queen. She was Cleopatra the Great's daughter, a Macedonian, and he was the last king of an ancient Phoenician lineage. While Cleopatra Selene was famous for her beauty and pedigree, widely admired in Rome, the daughter of Mark Antony, remarkably, Juba II was even more prestigious and popular. He was called Caius Julius Juba and was renowned for his scholarship, a genius who published dozens of books. Among his personal friends were Virgil, Horace, Livy, Agrippa, and the emperor. Both Ovid and Pliny highly praised Juba. Juba had amassed a great library, and among his literary treasures were sailing instructions to distant lands, like Britain and even the Americas, that had been zealously guarded by his Carthaginian and Phoenician ancestors. Diodorus wrote that during Juba II's reign, they kept this information secret in order to have a place for a refuge if needed. As will be seen, this refuge would be needed, for Rome was always in the habit of turning on her allies. Juba and Selene ruled over the Mauritanians, who were of Eastern origin, having come long ago from Canaan. Some believe that these people of North Africa had come as far back as when Joshua led the Israelites into Canaan. This founding of a kingdom of both Phoenician, Canaanite and ancient Israelite pedigree was 1344 years after 1369 BC, when Israelites took to the seas and sailed away from Palestine. It was 720 years after the 10 tribes of Israel in 745 BC were deported into Assyria, and this year was 500 years to the fall of Rome in 476 BC. 1. The lost treasure of King Juba. 4. The Greek myths. 24 BC, 3871 AM. Famous researcher and writer Strabo visited Egypt and studied the Great Pyramid, writing that the monument appeared as if it had been let down from heaven itself. In his time, the structure was still encased in gleaming smooth white limestone blocks that would not be removed until 1356 AD, 1380 years into the future. The Great Pyramid was completed in the year 1080 before the flood, or 2815 BC, and this year was 2815 years after the birth of Noah, in the first regnal year of the Anunnaki dynasty in 2839 BC. 23 BC, 3872 AM. King Juba II and Queen Cleopatra Selene moved to their seat at Mauritania, present-day Morocco, Algeria, and began building a magnificent kingdom. His scholastic knowledge led him to exploit the land's natural resources, and in a few years the kingdom of Mauritania grew rich and populous, with descendants of Phoenicians, Carthaginians, Hebrews, Jews, Syrians, local North Africans, Greeks, Macedonians, and otherwise Celtiberians from Spain and Romans. Juba II organised one of the largest libraries in antiquity and maintained an incredible treasury. Interestingly, this 23 BC date is isometrically linked to Juba's 23 AD death. 1. The lost treasure of King Juba. 20 BC, 3875 AM. Augustus Caesar visits Mauritania and is so impressed with its growth and majesty that he renames the city Caesarea. King Juba too does not realise the danger he and Cleopatra Selene are in, for Caesarea has caught the eye of Rome, and the ravening wolf has always taken by violence those things that it coveted. 19 BC, 3876 AM. Rome finally subdued all of Spain, the land later becoming the most thoroughly Romanised of all Europe. Also in this year, descendants of Israel were settled in the Crimea. A Hebrew Phoenician inscription found in a tomb in the Crimea from a Scythian burial dates to this year. Quote, "This is the tombstone of Buki, the son of Itchak, Isaac, the priest. May his rest be in Eden, at the time of the salvation of Israel, in the year 702 of the years of our exile." Unquote. 19 BC is 702 years after 721 BC, when the last of the 10 tribes of Israel were deported by Assyria and settled in southern Asia between the Caspian and Black Seas. Another Hebrew inscription found inside a Scythian tumuli reads, quote, "I am Jehudi, the son of Moses, the son of Jehudi, the son of Moses, the son of Jehudi the mighty, a man of the tribe of Naphtali, which was carried away captive with the other tribes of Israel by the prince Shalmaneser from Samaria, during the reign of Hosea, king of Israel." Unquote. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 17 BC, 3878 AM. This year marked the Roman century celebration. Augustus Caesar attended the secular games. As this was the century celebration, we see that the Roman chroniclers had lost an accurate account of the years. 17 BC does not line up with any important date in Roman or pre-Roman history, counting the centuries backward. However, it is 3.5 years off from 700 years, if the celebration began in 713 BC, when the year changed from 360 days to 365.25 days a year. Also in this year, King Herod begins the temple in Jerusalem, the Herodian temple, an attempt to quell the Jewish animosity against him. This is precisely 144 years after 161 BC, when the Jews cleansed the temple after Antiochus IV of Syria polluted the sanctuary with pig's blood. This was the 864th year from the founding of Samaria in 881 BC, the capital of Israel. 13 BC, 3882 AM. Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor, removed 2 Egyptian obelisks from Africa and had them transported to Rome and placed outside the Caesareum. These would later be removed to London and New York. The move of these artefacts was highly symbolic. Both London and New York are the seats financially of the British Empire and the United States, an empire of global scale, Britain and the USA fulfilling the prophecies concerning the tribe of adoption, Manasseh and Ephraim. As 740 year of Rome, this was 8880 months since Rome's founding in 753 BC. Both Britain and the United States would adopt Roman language in their political, scientific, legal and medical vernacular, Latin being the specialised language of the Western world. This was exactly 700 years after the change in the solar year from 360 days to 365.25 days a year, the 300th year of the Syrian-Greek Seleucid calendar, 1 Alexandria. 12 BC, 3883 AM. Augustus Caesar has a special copy of the Sibylline books made and deposited in the Temple of Apollo. Apollo was a figure prominent in the Greek prophecies concerning the last days, preserved in the Revelation record as Apollyon, the destroyer. It is to be recalled here that Augustus Caesar was named Octavian, the 8th, and this designation as the 8th, who was of the 7 according to the Revelation, is also linked to the figure of Apollyon in Revelation. The author of the Revelation borrowed his symbols from things of the past. Also in this year, the Romans erected a pyramid for the Praetor Gaius Cestius. Additionally, Augustus had one of the gigantic 200-ton obelisks at Memphis, erected in 1515 BC by Israelite slaves, by Thutmose III, removed and taken to Alexandria, where it then became known as Cleopatra's Needle. This 70-foot high monolith of red granite was originally quarried from the same site as the red granite used in the construction of the Great Pyramid. The obelisk would one day be taken to London, England. Augustus Caesar in this year also becomes chief priest of Jupiter, his office transformed into a religio-political one. Augustus Caesar's career seems to mirror the one painted by the prophets belonging to the Antichrist, a man who emerges and gains the trust of the people, who return their favour with unprecedented powers, political, religious and secular, before his true character and intentions emerge. 1. The Bible fraud. 2. Today, tomorrow and the great beyond. 8 BC, 3887 AM. Ovid was brought to Rome to stand before Caesar Augustus. For political reasons, the poet-historian was banished to the Black Sea. Ovid's Metamorphosis relates how the sun in antiquity moved from its place, following an uncharted path, and how a disaster overtook the world of men when the Bears, circumpolar constellation, plunged into the sea, pole shift, and the world was burned in flames as the cities of men were destroyed. 3 BC, 3892 AM. A series of 9 planetary conjunctions begins on May 19th and will continue on through August 26, 2 BC. It is believed by some that these conjunctions were what the Magi of the East watched for. Signs revealing the birth of the Saoshyant, Saviour, and end of the 3100 years of the Black Age of the Kali Yuga. C. 3103 BC. May 19, Mercury, Saturn, first and last planets. June 12, Venus, Saturn. August 12, Venus, Jupiter. August 31, Mercury, Venus. September 14, Jupiter Regulus, King Star. This final alignment was 108 days before the first day of 2 BC. Mercury was the messenger planet, Saturn the planet of mystery, and in ancient Hebrew symbolism, Saturn was the reaper, a messianic planet, the harvest being humanity. Venus was the newcomer and the planet of love to the Romans. Jupiter was king of the planets and Regulus was the king star, one of the 4 cornerstones of the zodiac in Leo. 4 stars formed the base of the cosmic pyramid, Regulus in Leo, Aldebaran in Taurus, Antares in Scorpio, and Fomalhaut in Aquarius. The polar star was the apex of the cosmic pyramid. This combination of conjunctions was enough to give those watching something to pay attention to. 1. The Secrets of Time. 2 BC, 3893 AM. As the Magi in the East studied the heavens, the signs continued on the 48th day of the new year on the Roman calendar. Feb 17, Jupiter Regulus. May 8th, Jupiter Regulus. June 17, Jupiter Venus. August 26, Jupiter Mars. Mars is now introduced in the conjunctions, planet of war. Combining all these planetary stellar concepts, in the sequence they appeared between 3 to 2 BC, we have an astronomical statement that reads conceptually as, "Message of one who is first and last, whose new coming is a mystery to mankind who is loved, a new message from King of heaven and earth, who brings judgment by fire and for mankind wages war against enemy." Christian tradition, without historical verification, claims that the Magi searched out Judea seeking for the birth of a child they knew to be the Saoshyant, the Messiah. These wise men brought gold, incense and myrrh as relics that were to be given to the Saviour in accordance with very ancient instructions. Christmas Eve was not the birth of Jesus or the Christ, but the date when the Magi delivered the gifts 120 days after the birth of the one we have come to call Jesus. It was the date mankind accepted his divinity. This date, December 25th, was already known through the ancient world in the Mithraic traditions, among the Magi in Zoroastrianism at Phrygia concerning the birth of Attis, the birth of Dionysus, and a host of other ancient saviour gods. The 2 BC date for the birth of the Christ is seen in a variety of ways. A. Tertullian wrote that Jesus was born 28 years after Queen Cleopatra died in Egypt. Her death was in 30 BC, thus 28 years would be 2 BC. B. Irenaeus wrote that Jesus was born in the 41st year of the reign of Augustus Caesar, who came to power in 43 BC, 4341 being 2 BC. C. Apollonius was born in 2 BC, a Samaritan miracle worker. In 303 AD, Hierocles wrote Philaletes, claiming that the entire Jesus story was manufactured around the life of Apollonius. D. Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote that London was founded in 2885 Annus Mundi, 1010 BC, and that Jesus was born 1008 years after the founding of London. 1010 BC minus 1008 years was 2 BC. E. Biblical chronologist Stephen Jones, in his Secrets of Time, dates the birth of Jesus at 2 BC. F. Vedic scholars assert that the Kali Yuga, Black Age, countdown to the coming of the Saviour, Saoshyant, was 3100 years, and this ancient Indian calendar began in 3103 BC. Some believe 3102 BC. This brings us to 3 to 2 BC. G. By researching the geometrical timeline encoded within the interior dimensions of the Great Pyramid, E. Raymond Capt determined that Jesus was born in 2 BC. H. Gematria specialist Bonnie Gaunt studied number codes in the biblical records and determined the birth of Jesus as 2 BC. I. The author of Luke 3:1-2 wrote that John the Baptist appeared in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. This statement is exactly where the Gospel of Marcion begins, which is believed to be the original Gospel, not to be confused with Gospel of Mark. C. 144 AD. Tiberius' reign began in 14 AD, and adding 15 years to 14 AD gives us 29 AD for when John began baptizing in his ministry of repentance. In verse 23 we read that Jesus was baptized when he was about 30 years old. This targets 2 to 1 BC as birth of Jesus. The dating of 2 BC as the birth of Jesus Apollonius by so many sources is rather remarkable considering the fact that almost the entire Christian Catholic world believes that this birth occurred in either 7 or 4 BC, the latter following Archbishop James Ussher's chronology, which is in error. Even if Joseph and Mary are mere inventions, the fact remains that Jesus, even in the Gospel accounts, was not Jewish but Galilean. Galilee was a distinctly non-Jewish region referred to by the prophet Isaiah in a messianic passage as Galilee of the nations, Hebrew, foreign people. This messianic passage in Isaiah continues, quote, "For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. The Lord sent a word unto Jacob, and it hath lighted upon Israel. And all the people shall know, even Ephraim, scattered Israelites, and the inhabitants of Samaria." Unquote. 1. Secrets of Time. 2. The Christ Conspiracy. 3. The Great Pyramid Decoded. 4. Beginnings, the Sacred Design. 5. History of the Christian religion to the year 200. 6. Isaiah. 1 BC, 3894 AM. The Qumran texts, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, record that in this year a comet appeared in conjunction with a planetary conjunction in Pisces. Because no comet appeared in 2 BC, some believe that the Magi followed the comet in accordance with a prophecy of Zoroaster. In this year, King Herod fell ill and died. Riots in Jerusalem caused Roman governor Archelaus to send troops into Jerusalem, and 3,000 people, mostly Jews, were killed in the temple precinct. A partial eclipse occurred on December 29th, almost 3 months before Passover. Herod died about a month after this partial eclipse. The date provided for in Jewish Megillat Ta'anith, written over 20 years later, a date equal to the Julian January 14th. This comet had returned after 984 years, last seen in 985 BC, a long-period comet. In this year, according to mathematicians who estimated that the whole world's population died off at about 2300 BC, Great Flood, there would have been approximately 300 million people alive on the planet at 1 BC, assuming the world was reduced to only 8 members about 2300 BC. In calendrics, this year was important because it was 930 years after Israel and Judah split into the divided kingdom in 931 BC. This was also 744 years since the 10 tribes of Israel in 745 BC were deported by the Assyrians. This year was 960 years after 961 BC, when the temple was finished by Solomon, Jedediah, and it was 880 years after Samaria was built in Israel in 881 BC. Finally, this was the 720th year since the last of the Israelites were deported in 721 BC by Assyria. 1. Our Haunted Planet. 2. History of the Christian religion to the year 200. 3. Time and the Bible's number code. 4. Evolution Cruncher. Anno Domini calendar. At this time the Anno Domini calendars did not exist. This calendar separating history between BC before Christ and AD Anno Domini, Year of the Lord, was designed by Dionysius Exiguus in the year 527 AD as a Roman calendar marking the year 1 as the year Christ was born, which Exiguus was of the opinion that Christ was born in the 754th year of Rome. He was off by 2 years. Christ was born in 2 BC. For the first 526 years of the AD calendar, it did not exist, being an entirely retroactively imposed system. There are so many amazing parallels between BC and AD dates concerning events that mirror one another that we are led to conclude that the Anno Domini system was inspired. The BC AD calendrical continuum is best understood when seen paralleled with the unbroken Annus Mundi chronology. 4 BC, 3891 AM. 3 BC, 3892 AM. 2 BC, 3893 AM. 1 BC, 3894 AM. 1 AD, 3895 AM. 2 AD, 3896 AM. 3 AD, 3897 AM. 4 AD, 3898 AM. 1 AD, 3895 AM. It is not without significance that in this year the Roman Emperor Augustus ordered the destruction of over 2,000 volumes of the Greek prophecies, an apparent attempt to forget the future. Much of what the Greeks knew was from the earlier Ionian sages, who were closer in succession from their ancient Israelite forebears. The Apocalypse, known as the Book of Revelation, was among those ancient Greek preserved writings on the future that was not destroyed, a text masked in later Christian garb. C. 96 AD. Another interesting fact about this year as the joint between the BC and AD timelines is the fact that Abraham was born in 1948 Annus Mundi, 1947 BC, and his descendants founded Israel. These descendants regathered in their ancient homeland in 1948 Anno Domini, when Israel became a state independent of foreign rule as per United Nations mandate. 1. Elder Gods in Antiquity. 6 AD, 3900 AM. A full-scale Roman invasion into German territory was thwarted when sudden uprisings occurred in Roman-occupied Pannonia and Dalmatia. The census of Rome occurred in Judea and Rome's eastern holdings, which in these regions was overseen by the governor of Syria named Quirinius. The census was very unpopular, and Judas of Galilee led an uprising against the Romans, supported by the feared Jewish assassins called the Sicarii, dagger men. This same Judas of Galilee is mentioned in the biblical book of Acts 5:37. 9 AD, 3903 AM. The Romans under General Varus attempted to invade Germania, but a Saxon chieftain formerly loyal to Rome, who had been trained by the Romans named Hermann of Germany, Arminius in Latin, united the German forces and ambushed 3 full Roman legions in the famous Battle of Teutoburg Forest. About 15,000 Romans were defeated and then killed in a series of hit-and-run attacks. The Rhine River became the boundary between Roman-controlled domains and those of the Germans. The Germans were descendants of the Cimmerians, the Scythian Gimri and Assyrian Bit Cumri, House of Omri, all names of migrating Israelites. This year was 753 years since the Israelites were deported in 745 BC by Assyria, the year 753 BC being the founding of Rome. This was 400 years after the Gauls, kin to Germans, sacked Rome and occupied it in 390 BC. 1. Tracing our ancestors. 2. A History of Civilization, Volume 1. 3. March of the Titans. 14 AD, 3908 AM. Caesar Augustus died and was succeeded by Tiberius Caesar. During a gladiatorial show put on by Germanicus, A meteor sped across the sky in broad daylight, alarming the people. The Roman military on the German frontier began a full mutiny over conditions and treatment, and was on the verge of violence when the men were astonished to see the full moon darken without a cloud in the sky, according to Tacitus. The moon reappeared only to fade away again. This unusual distraction quelled the rebellion, and a resolution was later adopted. This was 1460 years after Exodus, or 365 times 4. 1. Natural history, Pliny, Universe and the World. 2. Tacitus, Annals 1. 15 AD, 3909 AM. Germanicus, the adopted son of Tiberius Caesar, defeated the Germans in a series of battles and gained fame throughout the Roman Empire, alarming his adopted father. Tiberius then removed Germanicus from the war front and assigned him to handle problems in Asia. 17 AD, 3911 AM. A major earthquake levels the Greek cities of the Roman province of Asia Minor and Lydia. Tacitus wrote that the quake occurred at night and without warning, and those that sought refuge in the fields outside the cities were swallowed by the earth itself. Locals related that whole mountains appeared and others vanished. The most famous cities destroyed were Sardis and Philadelphia. The destruction of the Lydian cities is well documented. 12 cities destroyed at night, and the topography of the region altered. This was the 792nd year of the Greek Olympiad calendar. 1. Tacitus, Annals 2. 2. Ancient Mysteries. 18 AD, 3912 AM. Germanicus visited Actium, where Octavian had defeated the navy of Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He then went to Athens, sailed to Byzantium, and then on to the ruins of Troy before he sailed into the Black Sea. This year was 1656 years since Ephraim and Manasseh were adopted into the Israelite family in 1639 BC. 1. Tacitus, Annals 2. 19 AD, 3913 AM. Tiberius Caesar formally barred all Jews from Rome, even deporting those he could find. The Jews were seen as subversive, ever attempting to meddle in Roman administrative affairs. Concerning the Jews at that time, Seneca wrote, quote, "When, meanwhile, the customs of that accursed nation have gained such strength that they have been now received in all lands, the conquered have given laws to the conquerors." Unquote. The ban of Tiberius would not be very effective, as Jews would soon begin filtering back into the city. Germanicus visited Egypt and entered Alexandria, and Tacitus wrote that he beheld the pyramids on the pathless sands. He travelled in ancient Thebes in the interior and visited the statue of Memnon. Unfortunately, Germanicus was poisoned by the wife of a rival, and he died. The death of Germanicus may have been the result of a deeper scheme of Tiberius. Tacitus records many remarkable parallels between Alexander the Great and Germanicus. Both were famous for military exploits, both handsome, both died soon after 30 years old, and both suffered treachery by compatriots in a foreign land. Germanicus even died at Alexandria. Though Tacitus does not mention it, we recall that Alexander's own close colleagues held that he had been poisoned. Also to die in this year was the famed Roman poet Virgil, author of the Aeneid, the Latin sequel to Homer's Greek Iliad and Odyssey, that relates how the Trojan exiles settled in Italy, battled the Latins, and built the city of Lavinium long before they built Rome. In this year an island appeared in the Mediterranean called Thea. 1. March of the Titans. 2. Augustan, City of God, Book 6. 3. Tacitus, Annals 2. 4. The Antediluvian World. 27 AD, 3921 AM. A hastily constructed amphitheatre built by Attilius at Fidenae collapsed, killing and mutilating 50,000 people of all ages, some having been buried and crushed for days before being rescued. 1. Tacitus, Annals 4. 29 AD, 3923 AM. John the Baptist begins preaching and prophesying of the coming of the Messiah, known symbolically as the Stone of Israel. We are told that John is a cousin to Jesus. The story of the Gospel is a complex one, a bane to the historian, for nothing of the Gospel story was chronicled until at least 100 years after the Gospel events. What the early Christian faith actually was already existed in a myriad of forms. 30 AD, 3924 AM. If the Gospel and Apocryphal story was recorded accurately, then in this year King Herod imprisoned John the Baptist and beheaded him at the whim of his daughter, who was prompted to ask for John's head by her mother. Later, before several witnesses, this same girl was skating on the surface of a frozen lake when she plunged suddenly through the thin ice and was decapitated. Her head remained on the ice as her body floated off below the icy surface. The man history has passed on to us as Jesus was not from Judea. He was not a Jew, but even after almost 20 centuries he still remains a total mystery. Jesus was Galilean, Galilee becoming one of the most important places of early Christianity. Galilee did not border Judea, and nor was it made of Judean people. Galilee was a metropolitan region densely populated by many different ethnic backgrounds, situated on a major trade route. It was a region of strong Hellenistic influence, and the major language was not Aramaic or Hebrew but Greek. After his baptism, Jesus went straight back to Galilee, quote, preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God and saying, "The time is fulfilled," unquote. What time he referred to is unknown. However, it is fascinating that this year was exactly 1440 years, a major golden proportion number, after 1411 BC, when the Israelites conquered King Og of Bashan and Sihon of the Amorites for possession of the lands that would later be called Lower Syria, where Galilee and Samaria were located. This was also the year 960 of the divided kingdom, when Israel seceded from Judah and became the northern kingdom of Samaria in 931 BC. This year of Jesus' first year of ministry began a 40-year countdown to the total destruction of Jerusalem and Judea and the temple by the Romans at the end of the Jewish War in 70 AD. It is held that Jesus fulfilled the prophecy in Isaiah, quote, "In Galilee of the nations, the people that walked in darkness have seen a great light. They that dwell in the land of the shadow of death, upon them hath the light shined," unquote. The Jewish animosity against Jesus was ethnic. The inception of Christ's ministry offended the Jews, for Jesus taught and revealed only ancient Israelite articles of faith, quoting Israelite prophecies, and nothing of Jewish context was mentioned by Jesus unless uttered in condemnation. The Jews had become so separated from their earlier Israelite pedigree that they completely alienated their own kin in Galilee. In their defense, the Jews focused not on Jesus' teachings, but on where he was from, Galilee, saying proudly, quote, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth? For out of Galilee ariseth no prophet," unquote. The Jews of that day and hence have practiced a tainted religion they had brought out of Babylon, an admixture of Hebraism and a new system of beliefs called Talmudicism, never before known in Israel or Judah. Jesus chose his disciples from Galilee, with only Judas being a Jew. The Jews considered the Galileans to be Gentiles. This rift was not only in culture, character and geography, but genetic as well. The Galileans were formerly ancient Israelites in wandering after the Assyrians deported them in 745 BC and 721 BC. They have been Cimmerians of Samaria, Kimri, Gimri, Gimri, Galutha, Gauls. In fact, geographically, Galilee was the same land allotted to the 10 tribes of Israel, occupied, along with Samaria, before their deportations. Because of the Greek migrations from the days of Alexander 3 centuries or more earlier, and the building of the Decapolis, 10 cities, Galilee was thoroughly Greek, with a dense population of Samaritans and Syrians. Judaism was strong too, because the region had been forced by point of death over a century earlier to convert to Judaism. The forced conversion was a way to enrich the Jewish temple treasury. As the Jews by this time were an admixture of Judahites, Babylonians and Edomites, they appeared racially different from Jesus. The ancient Israelites were a very fair-featured people, with red hair being very prominent. Epiphanius Monachus wrote that Jesus was 6 feet tall, his hair long and golden coloured, with skin ruddy in complexion. Even as late as the Renaissance era, the masterpieces depicting Jesus depicted him and his mother Mary with red hair. The ancient Judahites shared the same features, but not the darker featured Jews 6 centuries later. Galilee was called Gaulantius by the Romans, who knew that Galilee was settled by the Gauls. As any reader of the BC portion of this Chronicon has seen, the Gauls were the direct descendants of Israelites in wandering. Even their neighbours, the Samaritans, by their own account, were the descendants of an admixture of people descended from the 10 tribes of Israel formerly deported. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, writing over 50 years later, may have mentioned Jesus in his monumental work, writing that an unnamed Samaritan leader was killed by Pontius Pilate, and that the Roman was sent to Rome to answer for his crime before Tiberius. As a Galilean, Jesus could easily have also been referred to as a Samaritan. The first proponents of Christianity in the form we recognise today were Galileans, and their first followers were Samaritans and some Jews. The whole Galilean movement was founded by Syrians, for this region was Lower Syria. Grant Allen in 1897 AD wrote in his Evolution of the Idea of God, quote, "Whatever else may be said of Christianity, it is at least fairly agreed on either side, both by friends and foes, that this great religion took its rise around the personality of a certain particular Galilean teacher by name Jesus." Unquote. 1 Matthew, 2 the Gospel Truth, 3 Mark, 4 Isaiah, 5 John, 7 the Evolution of the Idea of God, 8 the Dragon Legacy, 9 the Bible Fraud, 10 the Christ Conspiracy, 11 Jesus, God, Man or Myth,